And now we're live for the next 3 hours with nationally syndicated talk show host Thom Hartmann. He sits down with Book TV for in-depth to answer your questions and discuss his many books, including The Crash of 2016, Rebooting the American Dream, and Threshold.
Thom Hartmann, how'd you get into radio?
I got into radio when I was a teenager. First of all, when I was maybe 9 years old, I built a little 100 milliwatt transmitter, and which will reach like 3 houses around your house. And I had a record player, and I was very into electronics. I was a ham radio operator when I was 13. And I built a little radio station, and I did that at home as a kid. And then when I was 16, I got a job at MSU in Brody Hall in their radio station. Each of the major dorms had a radio station, and so I was on WBRD, as I recall. And I did that for about 6 weeks, made a tape, got a job at WITL, AM and FM, Lansing, Michigan, in which was the country western station, country station. #1 station in Lansing. It was great. It was a weekend, DJ, and I thought I hated country music. And I discovered that I absolutely loved country music, but I was a teenager in the 60s, and it was like rock and roll or nothing. And I worked there for a year or so, and then went to did an all-night show, progressive rock show, did top 40, and then went back to Whittle and did news for 7 years until 78. And then I got out of that, and then in 2002, November of 2002, Thanksgiving, we were living in Vermont, and Louise and I drove back to Michigan to visit our family for Thanksgiving. And all the way there, all I could get was, actually it was odd, it was like Sean Hannity's show repeated itself 3 or 4 times on that 14-hour drive. And he was doing a live remote from Habitat for Humanity, and only he was calling it Hannity for Humanity, and was talking about how no liberal's gonna get this house. And which kind of offended my sensibilities. But more than that, I was thinking, half the country votes Democratic, roughly. It's not like we're a totally red country, we're a purple country. There's got to be a market for the left-wing version of what Hannity's doing. So I wrote an op-ed for Common Dreams in, I think, probably around December of 2002, titled Talking Back to Talk Radio, which basically was a business plan. I've been in radio, I've been in the business, I know how it works. Here's how you can do it from a business point of view. Here's how you do it from a programming point of view, and put that out there. And then thought, in '97 we had sold an ad agency in Atlanta, and so we were essentially retired. And I thought, it'd be fun to try this out, see if we can do this. So, putting my money where my mouth was. So we found a radio station in Burlington, Vermont that would put me on the air for 2 hours on a Saturday morning after the swap meet. And for a few months there, I did a morning show. About half the calls I got were, "Is that John Deere tractor still available?" But again, we made a tape and took that to IE America Radio Network, which at the time was the only progressive radio network in America, preceded Air America. It was out of Detroit. It was owned by the UAW. And they picked me up noon to 3 and put us on 29 stations and Sirius XM, or Sirius at that time. XM was a competitor at the time. And that's how the show started. And then, Shelley and Anita Drobny asked me to come out to Chicago and meet with them and John Sinton. They had read my article, and they were thinking of starting a network based on what I had written about. And they did. They started Air America. And after a year or so of competing with Air America, maybe it was 2 years, whatever it was, they started syndicating my show. And then but I always owned the show. In fact, I think I was the only show, Ring of Fire was the other one, Papantonio and Kennedy's show. The only 2 shows that were actually owned by the host as opposed to being an employee.
Why do you think Air America went under?
I think it was a mixture of things. The biggest one was that they were undercapitalized. Fox News, Roger Ailes had, back when he was in the Nixon White House, had proposed or signed off on a proposal for something called GOP TV, and which kind of a early Fox News. Nixon couldn't raise the money, and so it never happened. And then he met Rupert Murdoch, and Murdoch said, "Sure, let's do this." But they lost $100 million a year for roughly 5 years before they made any money. So you could say, hey, Sean Hannity lost them in aggregate maybe $400 million. Isn't that a terrible failure? Well, no, after the 5th year they started making money. They caught an audience, and now they make a lot of money. Air America, when they declared bankruptcy, I think that they had gone through something like $16 or $17 million over a 5-6 year period. It's not a lot of money for a national radio network, particularly when part of their business model was leasing and radio stations. So I think that being undercapitalized was their biggest sin. There were some management problems. Some of the people in management really shouldn't have been there, and there were some programming issues that I disagreed with. I thought that they were creating some programs that were more like television than radio. There's a real big difference in those mediums. But I think the real big problem is they ran out of cash.
In several of your books, you refer to yourself as a serial entrepreneur.
Yeah. I started my first business when I was 17. It was a TV repair shop and stereo repair shop across the street from Michigan State University.
It was in a head shop, wasn't it?
It was in the back of a head shop, yeah. And we called it the electronics joint, and our logo was a joint with a TV antenna on it. And then we got a little less hippie when what I was doing was the guy who owned the head shop, I rented a shelf from him for $25 a month, and people would bring electronic equipment in to have it fixed. I'd pick it up every night, take it home and fix it, and bring it back the next day, and he'd collect the money, and he took a percentage of the money too. I think it was a quarter. And we grew out of that shelf in the head shop in about 4 months, and so we moved down the street and rented a place and ended up with 4 technicians and 6 or 7 employees total. My soon-to-be wife was our bookkeeper, and it was the first business I ever owned. It was also the only business that I've started that went down in flames, and I learned a lot from that. I learned an awful lot from that. So yeah, and then after that, we started an herbal tea company. We started an advertising agency. In '78, Louise and I moved to New Hampshire and started a community for abused kids. In '83, we moved back to Atlanta and started a travel agency. Built that from nothing up to about $6 million value, got it on the front page of the Wall Street Journal, sold it in '86, retired to Germany, moved to Germany with our kids for a year, living at and working with the nonprofit organization I've been working with since 1978, Salem International, that we had based the community for abused kids on. And then we came back in '87 from Germany and back to Atlanta and started an advertising agency, and that's the company I sold in '97 when we moved to Vermont to, quote, retire, and started the radio show, which just turned into this, it was going to be a hobby. And now I'm doing 4 hours of media every day, 5 days a week.
And where are you living?
I live down in the Southwest here in Washington, D.C.
When did you start, and why did you start writing books?
Again, this goes back to my childhood. My mom was an English major. She graduated magna cum laude from MSU back in the late 40s. And her aspiration was to be a writer, and she held writers the way people today think of movie stars. And I mean, she was just, and my dad had 20,000 books in the house, the whole basement. I mean, he had it organized like a library. He was a very organized guy. And I started writing as a young teenager. By the time I moved out of the house when I was 16, I had 56 rejection slips. I papered my bedroom wall with rejection slips, mostly for bad poetry and short stories. And I just kept doing it. And now I've got, I think, around 25 books in print.
Well, the first several books that you wrote were about attention deficit disorder.
Yeah, first several that I published.
Right.
I'd written probably 10 or 12 books before that, but none of them, thankfully, were ever published. Arthur C. Clarke says your first million words are practice, and it's true. But yeah, ADD. And that was the product of two things. when I was the executive director of the residential treatment facility up in New Hampshire, Salem Children's Village, and my wife was the program director. And so my job principally was to raise money and get publicity and things like that, the administrative stuff. But I noticed that virtually all of the kids that came in were coded as hyperactive, or back then it was referred to as hyperkinesis syndrome, hyperkinetic children, these kind of things. And in '78, the year that we started that, I think the year before that, Ben Feingold had published his book, Why Your Child is Hyperactive. And he proposed that it was food dyes, the salicylates specifically, that these children were reacting to with functionally an allergy. He was a pediatric allergist, by the way, so he had a certain bias. We did a study on our kids over a 6-month period, putting them on his diet, and we found that out of 34 kids, we had one kid that we could turn on and off like a light switch by putting salicylates into or taking them out of his diet. But he also had just horrible psoriasis, and they seemed to make his psoriasis worse. So I think that for a very small subset of the population, there is that allergy connection. But for most, I think it's just a way of brain wiring. And so I published, my first published piece on that was in, must have been around 1980, and it was in the Journal of Orthomolecular Psychiatry. It was on the hyperkinetic syndrome, suggesting that it was not a disease, but simply a different way of having your brain wired. And then when one of our children was diagnosed with ADHD in high school in the mid-'80s, and the psychologist sat in the room with him and said, you know, forget about going to college, you know, you should become a car mechanic, you know, you're good with your hands, you know, and by the way, if you're going to be a car mechanic, work on the foreign-made cars because the pay is a lot better. You know, if you're fixing Mercedes, you can make more money than fixing Fords. And at this point, my son is like tears in his face, you know, because he wanted to go to college. And I thought, this sucks. You know, this is a terrible way to describe this. And so I wrote my first book, ADD, A Different Perception, essentially to my son, and saying, you're not broken, nothing wrong with you. You have a different skill set than many other kids, but you also, there's a lot of people in your tribe. And he now has a master's degree in science and is running a business of his own based, you know, in that field. And God bless him. So yeah, so I wrote a couple of books on that. And then that became Time magazine did a story on it. It became a national bestseller, and so my publisher was like, I want another book and another book. And so.
Who are we talking about? This is a quote from you. He's the poster child for ADD, and if he didn't have ADD, we wouldn't have the United States of America.
Probably Ben Franklin. It's been a while since I wrote those books. Yeah, that clearly, in fact, there's in ADD, A Different Perception, I profile a couple of people, and as I recall, it was Ben Franklin, Thomas Edison, Sir Richard, what's his name? Same name as the guy who married Elizabeth Taylor.
Burton?
Burton, yeah, famous British explorer. He was such a classic case. Probably Richard Burton, Elizabeth Taylor's husband, had ADD too, you know, given his bouncing around and whatnot.
But why do you say that about Ben Franklin?
Ben Franklin never held one job for more than 3 years. He reinvented himself over 30 times, literally completely changed his profession, lived all over the world. He was easily bored. I think that the ADD can be, for a person who has a lower IQ, is more of a challenge. For a person like Franklin, who is a genius and had ADD, it can be a really useful combination. So I think for everybody it can be a useful combination.
So would you say that he was a serial entrepreneur?
Yes, he definitely was. An inventor, and you know, writer and publisher, and like I said, he helped create the United States of America.
2004, What Would Jefferson Do? Where did that book come from?
I wrote that book because I kept encountering revisionist history, specifically and particularly about Jefferson. There was kind of a resurgence of interest in Jefferson, I think largely after 9/11. But there are a couple of historians and I put that in quotes, I'm not sure that they have degrees in history, who were suggesting that Jefferson was a Bible-thumping Christian and that, you know, it was part of this whole America was founded on Christian values meme that there's several very well-organized groups out there pushing. And a number of other myths about Jefferson that I thought were important to knock down and just tell the actual story of Jefferson's life and what he did and what he was promoting.
Well, I think you write about the fact living in New Hampshire, you discovered some Jeffersonian materials in a house you were living in.
Yeah, it was Vermont, actually.
Vermont.
It was, and in fact, that's what really got me into it. You're right. Geez, I'd forgotten about that. How could I forget that? Time passes, right? We bought this house in 2001, I think it was, in Montpelier. And in the attic, there was a couple of boxes of old books, the attic of the carriage house that was attached to it. And they were just horribly weather damaged. You know, they had no value. Whoever had the house before us just left them there. And in fact, they'd been left there for a long time. There were a bunch of newspapers in the boxes from the 1930s. And there was a 10 or 20 volume set, I think it was a 20 volume set, The Collected Writings of Thomas Jefferson, which has only been published once in the history of the United States. And it was in 1909 by the Thomas Jefferson Memorial Association. And it had his personal diaries and all his letters and his autobiography and just all this stuff. And I spent a year, I mean, I was, quote, retired. I spent a year just reading, just living inside Jefferson's brain. And then, you know, like I said, I'm reading all this stuff out in the world that completely contradicts what I had just learned from. And I realized that there's something to be said for an objective voice of history. You know, Jefferson, obviously, in a lot of his writings, was thinking about the posterity. He was thinking about his own reputation and presented himself well, as you would expect. But the history is fairly clear. So, yeah, that led me to that book. That actually also led me to, when I started writing that book, the first draft became the book on equal protection, actually, because it was, Jefferson would be horrified by the idea that a corporation is a person.
Why?
Because, well, first of all, the corporate form in its modern form largely didn't exist back then. But although the British East India Company was the first modern corporation, Queen Elizabeth the first chartered it in, what, 1601. The first corporation was the Golden Hind. She did that, and she made a fortune on that, her and the members of Parliament. So then they chartered the British East India Company. And in 1773, Jefferson had published a pamphlet called A Summary View of the Rights of British Americans, as I recall. It's been almost 2 decades since I read this stuff. And it was basically a booklet about how to be a good British citizen in North America. That was in the summer. In the fall, late fall, early winter, England was suffering through a recession, a serious recession, a worldwide recession. And so they passed the Tea Act, which for some reason most people think was a tax increase on tea. But what it was actually, the East India Company stock was almost all owned by members of the British Parliament and the royal family. And the British East India Company was like going down the tubes. They were, because of this recession. And they had a monopoly on most of the businesses in the United States. And tea was what everybody drank. People didn't drink coffee in the early colonies. And there were, every block or every other block had a tea shop on it. They were the kind of cultural centers. And so the Tea Act of 1773 was the largest tax cut at that point in time, corporate tax cut in the history of the world. Not only did the East India Company have over 10 million pounds, as I recall. I think tons would be too much, but whatever it was a massive amount of tea in stock in the UK. They'd already paid tax on. And so it was a tax rebate on all that stuff. It was a tax cut combined with a rebate. So they got money back from the government. And then the goal was to sell that tea into North America. Because the problem that they were having in North America was about half the tea being consumed in all these tea shops was from, quote, smugglers. You know, it was from the Dutch trading companies, there were American trading companies. It was being brought in illegally. And they'd tried stopping that trade. They, you know, go all the way back to Captain Kidd, you know, let's hire a pirate and you know, stop it. They couldn't stop it. There was no way they could stop it. So they decided to undercut it. And so the British East India Company was bringing all this super discounted tea into the United States, and the citizens from Philadelphia up to Boston just freaked out and started this huge campaign to block the tea from even coming in. And in Charleston, they prevented them from coming into the harbors. In D.C., they prevented them from coming into the harbors. But they finally docked in Boston, and that led to basically a $1 million, in today's dollars, act of vandalism. They vandalized 3 of the ships quietly, respectfully, interestingly enough. I tracked down a copy of the only eyewitness account and got the original book. It was published in 1883 by Bliss and Company, and it was George Roundtree Hughes. And it had a long title, you know. In fact, he was the guy who came up with the phrase Boston Tea Party. And because they'd all sworn an oath of silence to each other, and this was 50 years later, and pretty much everybody else was dead, and he had been 16 or 17 years old when he participated in it. And so he wrote the book, and it was remarkable. I mean, this was an act of vandalism against the largest corporation in the world. So when you say, why would Jefferson be horrified by the idea that a corporation was a person? After the Boston Tea Party, Jefferson stopped talking about how to be a good citizen in the United States of the UK and started talking about separation. And this led right to 1776. So in a very real way, America was founded on a revolt against corporate power.
And that's what you write in Unequal Protection. The American Revolution was in fact provoked by the misbehavior of a British corporation. Our nation was founded in an anti-corporate power fury.
Yeah, it's true.
You also, one of the themes that I picked up in your books was that we were not an aristocracy. The white men who formed our nation were not necessarily an aristocracy, a rich landowning aristocracy.
Yeah, that was one of the most fascinating things that I got out of reading Jefferson's stuff and then digging deep into the history of that era. That is in What Would Jefferson Do? The myth of the rich founders. And there's been a couple of good histories about that published since that time. The wealthiest man among the people who signed the Declaration of Independence was John Hancock. And his net worth in today's dollars, or in 2004 dollars when I wrote the book, would be about $700,000. He was not a mind-bogglingly rich guy. Land had very little value. Some of them had fancy houses, but they were fancy houses by the standards of North America. They wouldn't have even been considered a squire's house in the UK. I mean, these people were not rich. There were rich people at the time of the American Revolution. The Johnson family, for example, who had a castle on the Hudson with several hundred African slaves and several hundred European slaves as, you know, Knights of the Round Table. I mean, they had kind of recreated this whole time. They were fabulously wealthy, and there were a number of families like that. Virtually all of them left. That family fled to Canada during the Revolution. So after the Revolution, I mean, Jefferson died in bankrupt. Washington died bankrupt. Madison was having problems. They were all just skating by, and among the slave owners, the slaves were their principal asset, which is a terrible and grim part of our history also. And then the other part was, you know, Jefferson worked aggressively to try to stop slavery, which is a part of his story that's not so often told. When he was in his early 20s in the Virginia House of Burgesses, he introduced legislation to end slavery in Virginia, and he was so punished by it, they passed a law saying that if anybody in Virginia freed a slave, that slave would be arrested and as I recall, it was like something like 2 years of hard labor and then sold back into the slave market. So I just, I kind of wanted to set the record straight.
From your book, 2013 book, The Crash of 2016, history tells us that when the foundations collapse and a society's cultural core is hollowed out and the madness takes hold, its members will pretend all is well. Life seems to go on as average citizens try to get by, while the very rich who understand what's happening consolidate their power and wealth before the final crash.
Yeah, it's a fairly typical cycle. People see these things coming. When we started the Children's Village back in the 70s, it was a vegetarian program. I've been a vegetarian since '68, or maybe '67. And so we got some prominent vegetarians on our board, and Gloria Swanson was one of them. And I used to go to New York every 6 months, and we'd just make dinner together in her apartment and sit and chat, stay up until the wee hours and talk. And she'd tell me these wild stories. And Joe Kennedy was the perennial object of her scorn. And she talked about how Joe Kennedy got out of the market, and how him and all his buddies knew that the crash was coming in 1929, and all this kind of stuff. I thought that was kind of interesting. It seems like we're recycling that now. We're sort of in a similar period.
And back to the Crash of 2016 book, you write in here that the beginning of the end of the crash of 2016 occurred in 2009 in January, when Barack Obama became president.
What we hoped would be the beginning of the end. The first stimulus, I mean, at the time we were losing 750,000 jobs a month. And that $800 million stimulus that we did here in the United States, well, a third of it was tax cuts, which don't generally stimulate the economy unless they're at the very bottom of the economic ladder, and most of them weren't. But it kind of jump-started us out of the horror that we were experiencing then. But then they couldn't get a second one or a larger one. We really, I think it was either Robert Reich or Paul Krugman who said there was a $2 trillion hole in the side of our economy, and we patched it with an $800 billion patch. It wasn't enough. And we also didn't change the fundamentals. We didn't reinstate Glass-Steagall. We didn't break up the big banks. We didn't hold the banksters accountable for what they did. We didn't change the derivative markets. We didn't make them more transparent or even just stop them altogether. At the time of, in 2007, just before the big crash, we had, I think there was in the neighborhood of $800 to $900 trillion in derivatives out there. These are kind of magical securities that are made up out of an underlying, they derive their value from an underlying asset, in this case mortgages. So you have $1 million worth of mortgages, you put an insurance policy on it for $1 million, and then you place a bet on that insurance, which is what AIG was doing. And then you place a bet on that insurance policy, say a $100 million bet that $1 million won't go bad. And then you place a $1 billion bet on the $100 million bet. And then you place a $100 billion bet on the $1 billion bet. And they just get bigger and bigger and bigger. I mean, the GDP of the entire planet is in the neighborhood of $56 trillion. And we had $800 to $900 trillion worth of derivatives. These just bets out there. And when that collapsed, it was massive. We get down to around 300 or 400 trillion. Nobody's really sure of these numbers, by the way, because there's not, Bank of International Settlements sort of collects the data. And we're back up now, the best guess is to in the neighborhood of $700 to $800 trillion in derivatives. So it's like we didn't fix these things, which is why I'm suggesting that crash has not stopped actually, and in fact it's gonna happen again, only worse.
Who are the economic royalists that you refer to?
That's a phrase that I borrowed with acknowledgement from Franklin Roosevelt, and my favorite of his speeches was his acceptance speech in 1936 in Philadelphia, as I recall, July of 1936, and where he talked about the economic royalists. And he said, out of this industrial order, it was fairly predictable that a group of economic royalists would arise to take to try to take control of this. These economic royalists tell us, he went after them. And it really was, it was the big money fat cats who crashed the economy in '29 and who fought FDR throughout his presidency. And it's the big money fat cats who are crashing our economy right now.
Thom Hartmann, in your book, Rebooting the American Dream, the math is pretty simple. When the uber rich are heavily taxed, economies prosper and wages for working people steadily rise. When taxes for the rich are cut, working people suffer and economies turn into casinos.
Yeah, and if you look at the time in the United States when the middle class was most prosperous, and this is the thing, when we measure prosperity in the United States, we tend to look at big numbers like GDP or the stock market. Those are not really the numbers that we should be looking at. If we're concerned about society as a whole, it should be how healthy is the middle class. And so what has happened over the years is that with this massive deregulation, the middle class has been collapsing steadily, and the very wealthy have gotten super wealthy. I got this up close and personal. I learned this lesson myself in 1974 or 5. Terry O'Connor was my business partner. He recently passed away, and he and I owned this herbal tea company, and we were making a lot of money. In fact, it was a side business of the herbal tea company. We were selling ginseng to Larry Flint, and he was selling it in Hustler magazine, and he made $1 million, literally, and we made a couple $100,000, which was big money in '73. And my CPA came to me, and he said, you're getting close to, as I recall, it was a 40 or 50% tax bracket. And he said, you need to stop taking money out of your company and reinvest it and grow the company, because it's an asset that you own also, and it won't be taxed. But if you just keep taking this money out as pay. And so I did, and we added another product line, we added another 7 employees, we grew the company. And that's what happened back in the 70s when the top tax rate was 90% or 74%. I forget when it dropped. I think Johnson dropped it down to 74% in '67. So yeah, it was. And back then, the average CEO made 30 times what his employees made. I probably made 6 or 8 times what my employees were making at that time. And there was a reason for it. If you made more than that, you got hit with these huge taxes. So keep the money in the company. Pay your employees well. All our employees had health insurance. All our employees were well paid. We had other benefit programs for them. When we opened the travel agency in '83 in Atlanta, we had health care, or we had not only health care for all our employees. Most of the people working the travel agents were young women who had kids. We built a daycare center inside the travel agency. It was just a little kind of a corner, but it worked. Companies don't think like that anymore. Now it's how do we squeeze every penny out of this so that we can pump that money up to the guy at the top, or the stockholders. And if there is a high tax level at the top, then the guys at the top say, okay, I got my 30 times, that's cool. It used to be that the CEOs lived in the neighborhoods of the middle class, with the exception of the very, very uber rich. And our economy is so different now than the economy that I grew up in.
Good afternoon and welcome to Book TV on C-SPAN 2. This is our monthly in-depth program where we invite one author on to talk about his or her body of work. This month, it's talk show host and author Thom Hartmann. As he indicated earlier, he's the author of about 25 books or so, and we'll be talking about them over the next 3 hours, showing you those covers as well. But as we always do on Book TV live programs, this is an interactive program, and we want to hear from you as well. So if you'd like to interact with our guest, author Thom Hartmann, here's several ways of doing so. We're going to begin with the phone numbers, 202-748-8200 if you live in the East and Central time zones, 202-748-8201 for those of you in the Mountain and Pacific time zones. You can also text Mr. Hartmann a message, 202-717-9684. Again, that's just for text messages. And if you do send one, please include your first name and where you're texting from, the city you live in. We have other ways via social media of getting a hold of our guest, and that includes email, booktv@cspan.org, is our email address. You can make a comment on our Facebook page, facebook.com/booktv. And finally, Twitter, @BookTV is our Twitter handle. And we'll begin taking those in just a few minutes. Mr. Hartmann, I want to show some video and then have you explain what this is.
Uh-oh. All of the money that was spent on television advertising by John McCain and Barack Obama together. Obama spent about, what, $600 million, $800 million?
It was $1.2 billion all in.
Oh,
PNC, MoveOn.org, everybody on the left was about 1.2.
1.2, and
on the right
McCain was about
600.
600 or 700 million.
Yep.
Right. Okay. So it was less than $2 billion. $2 billion is chump change for the health insurance industry right now. It's chump change for the pharmaceutical industry right now. It's walking around money for the oil industry right now. These large corporations can now say to any politician in America, we will make you, and you will be where you are forever, and when you retire, you'll have a good job with us for millions and millions of dollars a year, or we will destroy you. And they can absolutely make good on that threat. How is that a good thing for America?
Well, let's just start with the very fact that that wasn't my intent of why
I'm not
I
saying it
brought the
was
case.
your intent,
No,
but that was the outcome.
But
And I'm not blaming you for that. I'm just saying,
look,
what do we do now?
Right.
If you and I agree that that's not a good thing, what do we do?
Yeah, but I believe in more speech, and I believe that the American people are smart enough to understand, and I give the American people credit for being smart enough to know when they're trying to be bought. So I am not afraid of some big evil corporation who's going to run a bunch of 30-second ads before an election.
Thom Hartmann, what have we been watching?
That was David Bossie. He was the president of Citizens United, and which produced a hit piece movie on Hillary Clinton. I think David would probably describe it that way too. And they were going to play it within the 90-day window when the Federal Election Commission said you can't do political activity, within this 90 days prior to an election. He took that case to the Supreme Court and won. The Supreme Court ruled, yes, we affirm corporations are people. Going back to 1886, we affirm the 1976 Buckley versus Vallejo decision that spending money on politics prior to 1976, it was considered a behavior which could be regulated. Since 1976, that Supreme Court case, Lewis Powell was very instrumental in making that happen. It has been considered a protected First Amendment free speech. And I think that time has proven me out. I mean, look at the Donald Trump is agreeing with me right now, right? They're all owned by the rich people or the big corporations. Marco Rubio has his own personal billionaire who has been responsible for virtually his entire political career. Jeb Bush, I'm sure, has many, and not to mention family riches. You can just kind of go through the list, and when they lose their billionaires or when they lose their billionaire backing, they have to bail out. And to some extent, this happens on the Democratic side as well. The notable exception right now being Bernie Sanders, which is fascinating, by the way.
You talk to Bernie Sanders on a regular basis, don't you?
Yeah, when I lived in Vermont, he came on our program and took calls. And it was so novel to have a member of Congress, a sitting member of the House of Representatives, who would take calls unfiltered, unscreened. I mean, my wife was the call screener at that time, Louise. And basically all we looked for in terms of not letting people on the air was people who were drunk or who were profane. If they called up swearing or they sounded drunk, they didn't get on. But other than that, and Bernie just started taking these calls for an hour, and we called it Brunch with Bernie, and we've been doing it now since 2004, I think, every Friday. And it was amazing to me to discover a politician who never BS'd us, never tried to do the slick, the wiggle words, the weasel words and all that kind of stuff. If he believed something, he would say, here's what I believe. If he didn't know the answer, he'd say, I don't know the answer. Frequently, he'd say, I'll find out, and he'd come back next week and say, hey, somebody called last week and want to know about this. And I'm just amazed and impressed by Senator Sanders.
But you interviewed Dave Bossie.
Yeah.
Do you often interview people that you don't agree with?
More often than I interview people with whom I do agree. Yeah. It's, I think that talk radio, basically, there's a couple of different categories of ways that you can do radio, and this goes back to some of the early articles that I was writing when I was just playing with the idea of doing it. One is a guest-driven show, and which is popular. It's more popular in television than radio, but the problem with a guest-driven show is that the show's only as good as its guests, and you can't always get great guests. You can have a caller-driven show, but then your show's only as good as your callers. You can have a news-driven show, which is basically what CNN does, and look at what happens when you have a crisis. Their ratings go up, and when you don't, they fall in the tank. Or you can have a host-driven show, and in the modern era, Rush Limbaugh really invented that genre. And so when we put our show together, we decided that it would be a host-driven show because I knew radio and I knew my topics, and so most of the radio show is just me talking to listeners. And then there's the old adage: people slow down for fistfights and car wrecks. You want to make it entertaining. You want to make it interesting. And I actually respect most of the people on the other side who I debate. My father was an Eisenhower Republican activist.
Goldwater Republican, wasn't he?
When I was 13 years old in 1964, my dad and I went door to door for Barry Goldwater. In my heart, I knew he was right. I had read John Starmer's book, None Dare Call It Treason, the year earlier, and I was convinced that the State Department was filled with communists and that we were going to go down the tubes, and this was it. And 3 years later, the Vietnam War, in large part, I think, completely changed my political perspective. And then, from the time I was 16 until my dad died in 2006, he and I fought like cats and dogs about politics. And after the first couple of years, I mean, he actually threw me out of the house over a political argument one night when I was 16. But after a couple of years, we figured out how to do this without hurting our relationship. And my dad was my political foil throughout my life. He died a Republican. In fact, his two favorite pictures, when my father was dying in his living room, my brothers and I and a couple of their wives, Louise, were sitting with him. And as he was drawing his last breath, I was sitting there with my hand on his shoulder, and I looked across the bed that was in the living room now, and there on the wall were these two pictures: me shaking hands with Pope John Paul II, and George W. Bush on the aircraft carrier Abraham Lincoln declaring mission accomplished. And those were his, that was my dad, And so I learned that you can have a knockdown drag out with somebody and still respect them and love them even. And so that's become sort of a trademark of both my radio and TV show is to bring on both sides. I also think it's good for our viewers and listeners because they get to hear both sides of the argument. Like David Bossie saying, I want more speech. Well, that's fine. We all want more speech. But to say the American people are smart enough to figure out, to see through lies in advertising, for example, if that was true, then the industry that I owned 2 ad agencies over the years, the industry that I worked in for the better part of a decade, would not exist. I mean, if advertising didn't work, nobody would be doing it. And we'd have a completely different media model, completely different business model. The fact of the matter is that advertising does change people's minds. And if you spend $1 billion on advertising, you will produce a shift in opinion. And whether that should be done solely by and for the benefit of very wealthy individuals and large corporations in the political sphere or not is my fundamental disagreement with David and with Scalia and the others on the court who voted for Citizens United.
What's your reputation amongst conservatives?
I'm not altogether certain. I know a number of them I know and like and I'm friends with. There's a couple of conservative websites that love to do hit pieces on me. There was one a couple days ago that was, actually there were 2 in the last week. One was actually pretty straightforward, pretty honest. I had, Senator Whitehouse had called for corporations that fund climate denial to be prosecuted under the RICO Act, the same way that the tobacco companies were prosecuted in 1999 under the RICO Act for funding denial that tobacco causes cancer or is addictive. And that was a successful prosecution, by the way, 2006. The tobacco companies had to admit, yep, we were engaged in a crime. And so I went on the air and, debating with a conservative who was defending climate change denial and saying, if you're one of these guys who's like putting out the money and hiring the people and getting the message out, that's organized crime under the RICO statutes. You should be in jail. And they did a piece on this, and I thought, okay, they were criticizing me for it, but it was an honest portrayal. Then a couple days later, somebody else had, in the conservative media did a long hit piece on me where they took a logic chain that I went through on the air and deleted the entire middle of it. It was just a completely dishonest hit piece. So the first one I talked about on the air, I credited the author. I mean, hey, as like P.T. Barnum said, as long as you spell my name right. The second one, though, I just ignored. But I think.
But they're willing to come on your show.
Oh yeah, regularly, and many of them, and over many years, I've gotten to know many of them quite well.
From your book, Cracking the Code, a note to the reader. This book is written in a new language. Every word means precisely what it says. The tools of communication revealed herein are also used in its writings. And you go on to say that my aim with this book is to give you the tools to tell the liberal story and tell it well.
Yeah. That book started out as a book about neurolinguistic programming, NLP, which is a construct for communication. But it was a political year. As I recall, I wrote that in 2004 or 2008, one
I'll
of the other.
confirm that in 2 seconds.
Yeah, it was one of the presidential years. And, or maybe it was one of the interstitial years, but whatever. I wanted it to be a political hand guide for
2007.
For Democrats, yeah. So this is for the 2008 election. And that's why it's called Cracking the Code, is understanding, how not only how language works, but how to use language successfully.
What's an example?
The classic example is Frank Luntz renaming the estate tax as the death tax. It completely shifts the frame.
Pretty effective, though, wasn't it?
It was, and continues to be. And it didn't come out until much later that a lot of the early research into what kind of wording would cause people to turn against the estate tax was funded by the Walton heirs, and to the tune of a fair amount of money. And yeah, it was effective.
This Facebook comment, and this is from Philip. Tom, you are simply the best. You can tell you have done your homework. My question is, will Americans vote for a Jewish, democratic, socialist senior citizen who, by most educated people's estimation, would make America great again?
Yeah. I respond to that question with a question, which was posed to me in the fall of 2007 by, I believe, the number 2 guy in the Democratic Party in California. He might have been just the number 2 guy in the Democratic Party down in Los Angeles, but whatever. And he was African American. And he came on my program and he said, this was when Hillary Clinton and Barack Obama were fighting it out. And he said, nobody in America, at the end of the day, we can talk all we like about our first black president and all this kind of stuff, but nobody is going to vote for a guy who has only been in the Senate for 2 years, has basically very little experience in this field. He's African American and his middle name is Hussein. It ain't gonna happen. And this was an African American Democrat saying this on my program. And he was like, we have to get out there, and he says, I want to talk to the black community. We have to support Hillary Clinton because Barack Obama, there's no way he's going to become president. And yeah, guess who's president? So I think it's entirely possible that America will vote for a 70-something Jewish senator with a New York accent, because what he's saying is right. And this is the thing I learned in Vermont. Louise and I lived in Vermont for 10 years. And if you go up and drive around the Northeast Kingdom, which is the most conservative part, the most rural part of Vermont, it's solidly red. And you drive along the road and you will see in the election year, I remember 2000, in the election year, there would be a Bush for President sign and a Bernie for Congress sign next to each other. In lawn after lawn after lawn. Bernie consistently carries in the neighborhood of 20% of the Republican vote in Vermont. He was reelected with either 71 or 74% of the total vote to the Senate. And Vermont is not, you know, a hippie haven solid blue state. The two largest cities are Burlington and Montpelier. But you get outside those two cities and you are looking at, you know, red state, rural, conservative Republican country. And they have embraced Bernie because he's a truth teller. He's a radical truth teller.
Why'd you move to Washington?
We moved to Washington, D.C. 5 years ago. There was an opportunity to do a TV program on the RT network, which is owned by the Russians, and they wanted to get into, put an oar into the water of Al Jazeera and CNN International and BBC and all that. And I said, you know, I've always owned my own show. I won't become an employee. I have to have absolute editorial control by contract. And if you're willing to go along with those terms, which I'd had this conversation earlier with one of the big cable networks here in the United States, and they were unwilling to do that. They were like, you're an employee, you will do what we say, or not, or you won't work here. RT said, no, we'll give you your own show, or we'll carry your show. It's also carried by Free Speech TV. And so, you know, hey, it was something fun. You know, it was my ADD, I guess. You know, I was bored. Let's try something new.
And that show is still on the air, 7 and 10 p.m.?
Yes. Well, it's a 1 hour show. It runs at 7 p.m. on RT, and it runs at 10 p.m. on Free Speech TV.
And your radio
Monday
show?
through Friday. The radio show is noon to 3 Eastern Time. It's on Sirius XM. It's on radio stations around the country. It's also simulcast as television by Free Speech TV on Dish and Direct and a number of cable systems around.
And you can listen at thomhartmann.com as well, correct?
You can find, and you can find links to all that stuff there. And however you spell it will get you there. We've got all 4 misspellings.
Thom Hartmann is our guest. Let's take some calls. We're going to begin with a call from David in Hobe Sound, actually Marie in San Diego, California. Hi, Marie. You're on with Thom Hartmann.
Hi, thank you very much. I'm so delighted that Mr. Hartmann is on the air. I am a volunteer with a community radio station in San Diego, KNSJ, Networking for Social Justice, and we carry Mr. Hartmann's show, and we're so grateful that we're able to bring it to a San Diego audience, where the political climate is changing from a very conservative population to going to more liberal. So we really appreciate the brunch with Bernie and the different guests that Mr. Hartmann brings on. I have 3 questions. In light of the most recent shooting, I'm wondering if there is something in the DNA in America that for celebrities and others, if we hear something we don't like, that there are death threats. Secondly, I wonder if I keep hearing that people have short attention spans, and we're talking about some of our programming on our community radio station about the length of coverage that we give some things, and I disagree. I think I credit people with being more interested than just trying to encapsulate things. And I was wondering how Mr. Hartmann feels. And earlier he was talking about.
Do you know what, Marie? We are going to leave it there because we got a lot of callers on hold. Any response for that caller, Mr. Hartmann?
Sure. First of all, with regard to shooting, I don't think that there's anything unique in the American DNA that causes us to disproportionately murder each other with guns. I agree with President Obama that we are awash in guns, and so somebody who is crazy or violent or angry or suicidal, let's remember gun suicides are one of the biggest causes of death by guns in the United States. If you can just reach over, grab a gun, and bang like that, it's like, hey, it's over fast. Or this young man who shot up Roseburg, Oregon. If you've got 15 guns, you can do a lot of damage. So, as President Obama pointed out, we have no more or no fewer crazy people in the United States than they do in France or Germany or the United Kingdom or Australia or any place else. What we do have, the difference between us and all those other countries, is that in those countries, if you're a sports shooter, You have to be licensed, and in some of them insured, and your gun is registered, and or if you're a hunter, or if you want a gun for personal protection. And I've always advocated that we should treat guns the way we did cars. You know, back in the 19-teens, when cars started becoming ubiquitous and also started killing people, the problem was, what do we do with these things? They're killing people. And so we came up with standards, you know, red light, yellow light, green light, and those kind of things. But one of the most important standards that we came up with is, if you're going to drive a car, you have to A, prove that you're proficient and you know how to do it safely. You have to have a driver's license. B, you have to have liability insurance. So if you injure somebody else intentionally or unintentionally, they are covered. And C, the car has to be registered from the time of manufacture till the time of destruction with a chain of ownership. The liability insurance, I think, is one of the most important ones. And this is something that I would think that conservatives would embrace, because it's a market-based solution. If you have to have liability insurance to own a gun, it probably wouldn't be particularly expensive. You know, it might be $50 a year, $100 a year. But if you've got 3 DUIs, I'm guessing that the insurance actuaries, or a conviction for domestic violence, or you robbed a liquor store 3 years ago, I'm guessing that those actuaries would go, okay, this guy's price is going to be $4,000 a year for his liability insurance. And so what you would see is the marketplace putting pressure on, just like they do with drunk drivers, you know, with the car insurance companies. They jack up your insurance rates. And so that's where I would start, actually, along with closing the gun show loopholes and things like that. But I don't think there's anything unique about us except that we're awash in guns, number one. And with regard to the wall-to-wall coverage, which we've been watching for the last couple of days, yeah, I agree. In fact, Louise and I were watching, I think it was MSNBC the other day, and the host was slowly, painfully, you know, we don't know yet, and we're, you know, all this. And I'm like, can't you say, in other news around the world, you know, let's go now to the refugee crisis in Europe. Let's talk about, you know, or something, you know. But we live in a if it bleeds, it leads world. It's all about ratings. It's all about making money, which it didn't used to be. When I was doing news in the 70s, because of the fairness doctrine, which did not require, if you've got a liberal on, you've got to have a conservative on. That's a canard. The essence of the fairness doctrine was that your license will not be renewed if you do not program in the public interest. And the principal way that radio and television stations program in the public interest was by carrying news. And as a news reporter in a local station, and our news division lost money for WITL. There was like 4 or 5 of us working in news. That was the license for the station. And in '87, Reagan stopped enforcement of the fairness doctrine. And within 6 months, CBS had moved their vice president of news over to work under the vice president of entertainment, and turned their news division into a profit-making thing. And within a year, the other 2 networks had done the same. And now it's it's news for profit. And that's why we have infotainment rather than real news, frankly. And that's why the news will obsess on a particular topic, because they think that that's going to draw the most eyeballs.
Now, Thom Hartmann, I'm flipping through all your books because I remember reading that you don't think that a fairness doctrine is necessary for radio.
Yeah.
Is that correct?
I don't think that the way that the fairness doctrine was characterized, and to some extent, you know, like if a television station editorialized and said, you know, we think Bernie Sanders is a terrible guy, then the fairness doctrine required that after that editorial, somebody come on who would say, no, Bernie Sanders is a decent guy. But that was about it. And it was and back in the day, radio and TV stations used to do editorials. And so it was some balance in that. But in terms of guests, no, I see nothing wrong with a station carrying conservative or progressive programming all day long. I don't want the government involved in telling us how to program. I think that the role of government historically is sort of like the role of the NFL. You know, you've got the game of politics, you've got the game of business. These are basically, you know, activities that we participate in, not unlike a football game. And the NFL says, okay, here there's 100 yards on the field, here are the rules, here's the punishment for breaking the rules. You know, they define the rules of the game. And the rules of the game prior to '87 were defined in a way that encouraged actual news and encouraged a well-educated populace. Since '87, the rules of the game in news, anyway, have been completely changed. So now we get the news that makes the most profit for the people delivering the news to us. Whether that's the fact that, NBC also owns NBC Universal. So instead of news tonight, we're going to talk with the movie star of the latest Universal movie or whatever. It's just, and not to pick on NBC. I mean, everybody does this. I don't think it serves our democracy well, frankly.
Sean in Battleground, Washington, please go ahead with your question or comment for Thom Hartmann.
Tom, it's almost been 30 years since Michael Moore made his documentary Roger and Me. Then he also went on to make Bowling for Columbine, and the point he made there was that it's not about gun control, it's about our miserly social safety net, how most other industrialized countries have far more generous social safety nets. It just seems that we've witnessed this slow-motion train wreck of class war in this country with the destruction of the middle class, and the cheaters are prospering. No one has been punished and sent to jail for the Wall Street takedown of the economy. The same can be said for the invasion and occupation of Iraq. Richard Wolff is a regular guest on your show, and he makes the point that Americans no longer have any leverage against the plutocracy. We're not needed as workers with the free trade agreements. We're not needed as consumers as new markets are opened up overseas. Could you please talk about the Taft-Hartley Act and the Powell Memo and how Americans no longer have any leverage to fight back against Wall Street? And go Bernie. Thanks, Tom.
Okay, thanks. Taft-Hartley was, well, back up a little bit. Prior to 1935, you had unions did not have federal protection, and so if you were unionizing in a company that was that hired the Pinkertons or other strikebuster groups, you had a really good chance of being killed, and a lot of people died in the union movement, particularly between the 1870s when we really began to industrialize the United States in the 1930s. With the Wagner Act in 1935, the National Labor Relations Act, unions became legal and protected. Your right to unionize was protected. Unions are a democracy in the workplace, and therefore I think very important to the workplace. In 1946, for the first time since the election of 1932, the Republicans took control of Congress for 2 years. And they passed the Taft-Hartley Act, which blew a big hole in the side of the Wagner Act, of the National Labor Relations Act, that allowed individual states to basically opt out of the union protections of the Wagner Act and become so-called right-to-work, I call it right-to-work for less, states. And this was largely confined to the Deep South for most of our history, since '47. Although now, Scott Walker did it in Wisconsin, John Kasich in Indiana, I think Rick Snyder in Michigan. I'd have to go back and look. But this was the beginning of the war on labor, on working people in the United States. And then it really went on steroids with the Reagan administration. If you look at the history of productivity and workers' wages from the George Washington administration to the Ronald Reagan administration, those two numbers kind of climbed in concert with each other. As workers were more productive, in some cases as the result of mechanization, but as workers made more money for their employers, they made more money themselves. And then in 1981, you see these lines diverge, and productivity continues to go up and wages flatten out. And wages right now are actually below where they were in 1980 when Reagan was elected, in '81 when he came into office. And this is the natural consequence, I think, of that. Lewis Powell in '71, in the Powell Memo, in response in large part to Ralph Nader and Rachel Carlson. In fact, he talked about it in the Powell Memo, Unsafe at Any Speed and Silent Spring. He said, these books have created consumer movements, and these consumers are trying to regulate our businesses and trying to politicize our businesses, and we need to fight back. Traditionally, business has not been political. Business needs to become political. We need to set up think tanks. We need to set up an organization that will eventually take over the judiciary of the United States. We need to take over Congress. We need to take control of the political parties. We need to gain control over the media. to the extent possible. You know, you went through this list, and in my book, The Crash of 2016, I summarized the Powell Memo, and there's a whole chapter about Lewis Powell and the Powell Memo in there, because I see that as kind of the starting point of the modern crash right now. It's the deregulation of the American banking industry that FDR had put into place in '35, along with a whole bunch of other industries. So between that and so-called free trade, where we are basically the only country in the developed world that no longer protects our workers. It used to be everybody did it with tariffs. This was proposed by Alexander Hamilton in 1791 in his report on manufacturers. It was adopted in large part by Congress or by executive action by 1793. And tariffs, which are taxes on imported goods. This is what Donald Trump talks about when he says, you know, if Ford wants to build a car factory in Mexico, fine, let them. But when that car hits the border, there'll be a 35% tax on it coming into the United States. That's called a tariff. Tariffs provided 100% of the revenue that supported the federal government of the United States from 1787, when we officially started as a country, until the Civil War, 100%. From the Civil War to World War I, they were 2/3 of total federal revenue. Between 2/3 and 3/4, it declined over that time. From World War I to World War II, it was fully 1/3 of our federal revenue. And during that period of time, and right up until the 80s, you know, our average tariff rates fluctuated in the neighborhood of 20 to 30%. And so, you know, the theory was, as Hamilton laid out, was, you know, if you can make a pair of shoes in Connecticut with $1 worth of labor, or you can make that pair of shoes in Mexico with 50 cents worth of labor, or in China with 20 cents worth of labor, then when the shoes come in from Mexico, we're going to hit them with a 50-cent tax. When they come in from China, we're going to hit them with an 80-cent tax. So it's going to cost you the same to make the shoes anywhere in the world. You might as well make them here. You don't have to pay for shipping. And so we used to make shoes here, and we used to make blue jeans, and we used to make clothing, and we used to make chairs, and now we don't make any of that stuff, or very little of it, because it's, you know, because we did away with our tariffs. Other countries, the other developed countries, if you look at China, at Taiwan, which arguably is a developing country, but Taiwan, South Korea, Japan, all of the European countries, they had in the background something that they could use when they said, oh, we'll all join the WTO and drop our tariffs, right? So our tariffs, the US average tariffs now are around 2%. So we've all dropped our tariffs. So they use their VAT tax, value-added tax, as a tariff, as a functional tariff. The way a VAT tax works is every time you add value to a manufactured good, you pay a small tax. So when iron ore is mined and smelted into pig iron, pay a small tax. Take that pig iron, convert it into steel, pay a small tax. Convert that steel into rolled steel, pay a small tax. Convert that rolled steel into a car door, pay a small tax. Convert the car door into a car, pay a small tax. And so with Germany, for example, the average VAT tax on a car is around 17%. And German taxpayers pay that. So the way that they use this, and all these countries are doing this, except us, we're the village idiots. I find myself channeling Donald Trump way more than I would like to, but in any case, but he's right on these things. What they do is they say, okay, if you want to ship a Mercedes from Germany to the United States, we're going to give you a 17% reimbursement on that VAT tax because you're not a German. So that's a subsidized export. On the other hand, if you want to take an American car and sell it in Germany, we're going to put a 17% VAT tax on it when it enters our country because our cars have a 17% tax. That's functionally an import tariff. And when you combine the two, you've got, you know, what, 37, 38%, 34%, whatever 17 plus 17 is, 34% functional tariff, you know, in both directions. And that's why all these countries are running huge trade surpluses, and we're running a $600 to $800 billion a year trade deficit. And it really flipped in the 80s. When Reagan came into office in 1981, we were the world's largest creditor. More countries owed us money than any other country in the history of the world. We imported raw materials. We imported iron ore. We imported wood. And we manufactured things out of it. And we were the world's largest importer of raw materials and the world's largest exporter of finished goods. These are really, that's a sign of a healthy economy, and we had a net positive trade balance. So, you know, we were accumulating money coming from other countries, and so we were investing in those other countries, which some people decried as neocolonialism, but whatever. By the end of the Herbert Walker Bush administration, basically the end of the Reagan era, we had become the world's largest debtor. We had become the world's largest importer of finished goods and the world's largest exporter of raw materials. So now we ship coal and iron ore and wood to China, and they ship us back computers and furniture and, I mean, you name it, right? And then we owe them, I think our trade deficit with China right now is in the neighborhood of $200 billion a year. And the consequence of this is that now 1/7 of all assets in the United States are owned by foreigners. Because, you know, if you end up with, the rest of the world is ending up every year with roughly $600 billion in surplus dollars because we borrowed from the Chinese and then bought their stuff. We got the stuff, they got the dollars. Where do you spend dollars? Here, ultimately. And so, you know, a couple nights ago I was at the UN for the General Assembly, and we had a dinner in the Waldorf Astoria. Guess what? It just got bought by the Chinese. So it's not that I'm trying to promote xenophobia, but I just don't think it's a good thing when 1/7 of your country is no longer owned by your countrymen and women. So anyway, long response. I think the caller asked me what time it was, and I told her how to build a clock, or him, excuse me.
From your book, Rebooting the American Dream, 11 Ways to Rebuild Our Country, you list in here Alexander Hamilton's 11-point plan for American manufacturers.
Yep.
Those strategic proposals built the greatest industrial powerhouse the world had ever seen, and after more than 200 successful years, were abandoned only during the administrations of Ronald Reagan, George H.W. Bush, and Bill Clinton, and remain abandoned to this day.
That's
Again,
correct.
here's the cover of the book, Rebooting the American Dream. If that is something you're interested in reading about, this text for you, Thom Hartmann. Why is Citizens United not okay, but unions are entirely political? Also, should unions be taxed 35% like corporations?
Interesting questions. First of all, unions are not-for-profit organizations, so they don't generate a profit, so there would be nothing to tax. Secondly, the confluence of Citizens United and unions, I'm guessing the question was, should unions be able to run ads in favor of or opposed to candidates the same as General Electric can, or David and Charles Koch can, or one of their front groups, you know, Freedom Works or whatever. And my answer to that is no. I don't think that any corporation, and unions are corporations, even though they're nonprofit corporations, I don't think that any corporation should have rights guaranteed under our Constitution of, quote, free political speech. And I think that that would work to the benefit of unions, actually, if we were to say, we're going to reverse Citizens United, and not just for corporations, but for unions as well. By the way, Taft-Hartley in 1947 limited unions' political activity dramatically. And right now, if you pay union dues, if you're in a union, there's two things that you pay that union. And I'm a member of SAG-AFTRA. I'm real familiar with this. And my dad was, you know, worked in a union machine shop for 40 years. Two of my brothers have been union shop stewards in the printing union and the IBEW, electrical workers. You pay the union dues, which basically pay for the lawyers who represent you if you're in a dispute with your employer, the negotiators who negotiate your pay package, those kind of things. And then you can also pay into the union's political action fund function. You know, it's typically not called that, but that's what they are. That second category of payments are voluntary. You can simply, in some cases, opt out. In other cases, you have to opt in. But you can say to the union, you may not use my money for politics, and I'm not going to give you that extra money to use for politics. And, you know, a lot of people do that. And I frankly, I don't have a big problem with that. So I think unions should be representing their workers. But the way that this would benefit unions is that if we were to say AT&T and the union both can't engage in political activity anymore. They can't own a congressman, their favorite congressman, and they can't, you know, run television advertising. So now the president of AT&T sends a letter to all of his employees saying, we think Mitt Romney's the best presidential candidate. We really like him. You should get out and help him. What's the average employee going to do? The president says I should do this? You know, that's not going to influence me. On the other hand, a union is a democracy. It takes a 50% vote of the employees to create the union. A 50% vote can dissolve the union. And if the union is going to take any political position, it has to be a majority vote. And so when the union holds an election to decide who are we going to represent, what are we going to do, or asks their members what should we do. And you see this right now with a couple of unions that are debating whether to endorse Hillary or Bernie, for example. There's a huge battle going on in a couple of unions.
Or Donald Trump.
Yeah, around this. When that happens, the union, even if they don't put a penny into that campaign, you now have the union member. If the union sends out a letter to all their membership saying 51% or 60% or 70% of our members just decided that we're going to endorse, like with National Nurses United, their membership endorsed Bernie. I think it's the largest, mostly women union in the United States, and it's also one of the larger unions in the United States. And even if they don't spend a penny in the political world, they now have probably at least half of their members who are willing to show up and help out. They'll walk, they'll do what my dad and I did in '64 for Barry Goldwater. They'll go door to door and share the message with people and things like that, because it's a democracy, because it's a group that is interested, that is there for each other rather than there for just the employer, for example. Oh, yeah.
Next call for time. Yes, some noises coming out of the ceiling here in the
strange fan.
We'll just keep moving. Adrian is in Houston, Texas. Adrian, thanks for holding. You're on with author and talk show host Thom Hartmann.
Thank you. My brother lives in California. He talks about Tom all the time, so I'm glad to talk to him. When he mentioned Glass-Steagall, I was so grateful, because Elizabeth Warren is the only person that I've seen that's even brought this up. And
Bernie
when
Sanders
the crash happened in 2008, that's the first thing that came to my mind, Glass-Steagall. That was a slippery slope, I feel like, what happened to us. And I wonder, does he think we will ever see a facsimile of Glass-Steagall? Will we ever see anything like it? And let's not leave NAFTA out of this. That messed up the economy. And so it almost makes me think, about Democrats and Republicans, why the electorate is mad, all of us, because we don't feel like there's a dime's worth of difference.
Yeah.
There you go.
Glass-Steagall, for people who don't know what we're talking about here, in the early 30s, and it was either 33 or 35, the Glass-Steagall Act separated investment banking from retail banking. One of the things that provoked the Great Crash and made it so bad that the week that Franklin Roosevelt became president, every bank in the United States failed, which is an amazing thing when you think about it. The reason it was so bad is that banks were also casinos. They were running stock gambling operations, and everybody was getting in on it, leading up to the Great Crash of '29. And so when the gambling operations went down, the checkbook savings operation went down, all those kind of things. My mother's family was fairly prominent in the 20s, and they lost everything in the crash of '29. I mean, because the bank that had all their money just said, sorry, we don't have your money anymore. It's gone. We're closing our doors. And this happened to millions of Americans. And so what Glass-Steagall did was it said that boring banking business, which is basically the lubrication for an economy, the ability to have a checking account, a savings account, and get business loans and a mortgage, that is now going to be done in one area of banking. That's the old-fashioned, boring, banker's hours banking. It's predictable, predictably moderately profitable, but it's basically boring. And the gambling stuff, you want to engage in the stock market, go to a brokerage house. Go to a quote bank that is an investment bank. And so you had the rise of the Merrill Lynches and you had the rise of the banks. And they were kept separate from 35, as I recall, right up until either 99 or 2000, when Ken Lay of Enron there were two things he wanted. He wanted to be able to speculate in energy as if it was a commodity, and he couldn't. And he wanted to be able to get the banks off his back. He had 800 different holding companies, and he was shifting money around to make this company look profitable and this company, hiding his losses. And the banks were starting to catch on to him. So he wanted to own his own bank. And Wendy Graham had been on his board of directors for a number of years. She was the wife of Phil Graham, the senator from Texas. Phil Graham introduced legislation to do this, to do what, in my opinion, what Ken Lay wanted, in two pieces of legislation. One was the Commodity Futures Modernization Act, which led to basically the deregulation of commodities and led to this whole derivative thing that I think we were talking about earlier. And the second was Gramm-Leach-Bliley, which repealed the Glass-Steagall Act. And the argument that Graham and his allies made was, you know, this Glass-Steagall Act has kept us from having a banking crisis ever since 1935. It's done its work. It's time to retire it. And I think if he had made that argument in 1950 or 1960 on the floor of the Senate, when there were senators who were alive in 1929, they would have laughed him off if they didn't run him out with a pitchfork. But because, you know, as Arnold Toynbee says, you know, when the last man who remembers the horrors of the last great war dies, the next great war becomes inevitable. You know, we don't remember the genesis of the awful stuff. So, you know, pretty much everybody was dead who remembered the great crash in 1999, and so Congress passed and blew up Glass-Steagall, and the banks and the gambling houses merged, and we're right back where we were in 1929, which is something that we need to do something about. Senator Sanders has called for a reinstatement of Glass-Steagall, as has Elizabeth Warren, and I think we need to do that. I think it's very important. I don't remember her second point, I'm sorry. Do you, Peter?
No. We're going to move on,
Right.
and we'll get this question from Fran in Los Angeles.
Okay.
What one book written by you or anyone else gives the best information on income inequality? This is a text.
Probably Screwed. Screwed is a book that I wrote some years back about the plight of the middle class in the United States and how we got here. And although the crash of 2016 has a lot of that material in it as well, but in Screwed I tried to get back to first principles. I mean, I went all the way back to the origin of economies and the origin of democracy. Thomas Hobbes, Jean-Jacques Rousseau, Thomas Jefferson, you know, the Enlightenment, and right up to today. So that would be the book.
John in West Palm Beach, Florida, please go ahead with your question or comment for author Thom Hartmann.
Good afternoon. I always hate waiting an hour because then there's so many other questions I want to ask. Just a few comments, if I may. I grew up in a Democratic household, and my father belonged to the International Brotherhood of Electrical Workers, and now I am a flaming conservative. I always loved the Margaret Thatcher quote that says that socialism is great until you run out of other people's money. As far as the right to spend money for elections, I mean, that's critical thinking. It's not taught anymore. I was taught critical thinking growing up in the 60s.
So you're making the argument that we could, that if somebody runs an ad on television that says, hey, if you take this pill, it'll cure you of this, and doesn't tell you that, oh, by the way, it might also cause that we can critically think our way out of being lied to in a television ad?
You haven't been seeing those commercials, don't you? Don't you see all that little fine print and the guy talking 1,000 miles a minute? Your eyes might pop out and your arms might fall off, and you might need to call your doctor immediately. Yeah. Anyway, driving is a privilege, not a right.
Actually, Article 1, Section 8 of the Constitution authorizes Congress to build roads. It's in the Constitution.
Well, that has nothing to do with driving. I mean, come on, a carriage? Did they have licenses to drive a horse and buggy back then?
I don't think so.
The right to bear arms is in the Constitution also, okay? So that's...
In order to maintain a well-regulated militia.
I thought I could be friendly with you saying that I was, raised in a Democratic household. I mean, I thought we were going to get off on the right foot here. But anyway, my question to you is, and I'll give you a clue, I'm from Danbury, Connecticut, and I'd like to read you something real quickly. The quote is, in extracting the pure principles which Jesus taught, we should have to strip off the artificial vestments in which they have been muffled. There will be found, remaining, the most sublime and benevolent code of morals which has ever been offered to man. Now, that's a letter from Thomas Jefferson in 1813 to John Adams.
Yeah.
Now, I'm not saying that Jefferson was the greatest Christian of all time.
Have you ever read the Jefferson Bible?
Well, I know he cut out what he wanted to. That's fine.
He cut out all the miracles. He did not believe that Jesus was divine. He cut out all the miracles. That book is still in print, by the way.
Okay, but how do you explain the quote I just gave?
All right, John, we're gonna leave it there. Thanks for calling in. Thanks for participating today, Mr. Hartmann.
It's true that Jesus taught moral principles. It's also true that these are part of our DNA, that as a species, altruism is natural to us. In six-month-old babies, you see them unhappy when one baby is given more than another baby in their presence. Fairness is in our DNA. Altruism is in our DNA. Socialism is in our DNA, for lack of a better way of saying it. There are tribes all over the world that have never heard of Jesus that live in a very altruistic fashion, and always have. In fact, this was one of the things that most amazed me reading Jefferson's works, was when he was a child, his father was a surveyor in Virginia. And at the time, probably 80-90% of Virginia was Indian Territory. And his father spoke 5 different Indian languages. Jefferson spoke a couple of them. And he would travel with his father when he was out surveying these Indian territories, and he would live with the Native Americans. And he was so impressed by their high moral character. And he writes about it over and over and over again. He actually, at one point, dances around the edge of, thinking that maybe the Native Americans were actually genetically superior to the white Europeans. This was an era when the genetic superiority of white Europeans over African Americans was used as the excuse for slavery. So, it's stuff that we would laugh at now or be disgusted by. But in any case, he was just so impressed by the Native Americans. Saying something nice about Jesus does not make one a Christian. And Jefferson was very clear that the frauds of the clergy, as he referred to it probably 40 or 50 times in his various letters, were one of the big crises that could face America. Jefferson and Madison had a series of really interesting letters in 1787, when Jefferson was the envoy to France and Madison was helping write the Constitution. And Madison was Jefferson's protege. They were very close friends. And Madison was about 20 years younger. And Madison was, as I recall, a Presbyterian. He might have been a Congregationalist, but he was a Christian. And Jefferson was a deist, openly, not a Christian. Deists believe that some intelligence brought the universe into being and then just stepped back. That, quote, God doesn't interfere with day-to-day life, but that everything came out of something that is sacred and divine. So a deist would see the world and see it as alive and sacred, but would not pray to anybody to do anything. Intercessory prayer, which is not part of deism. So anyhow, Jefferson and Madison had this correspondence where Madison was concerned that if government ever started subsidizing churches or even providing them with very specific protections, and this turned into quite a discussion around the First Amendment, that the churches would become corrupted. And Madison was very concerned about Christianity. He did not want it to be corrupted by government. Jefferson, on the other hand, was concerned about a priest becoming president or a member of Congress. He thought that members of the clergy should be essentially banned from political service. I mean, he never came out specifically for a ban, but he was very worried about that. And he was very concerned that religion would corrupt government. So is government going to corrupt religion, or is religion going to corrupt government? And Madison got his see, I told you so during the first couple of weeks of his new presidency in whatever year he became president, 1809, as I recall. He vetoed, up until that point, George Washington had put into place the first welfare program in the United States. It was to pay for the poorhouses in Washington, D.C., to pay for medical care, housing, clothing, and food for poor people, for the paupers. And the federal government paid for this directly, from the George Washington administration through the Jefferson, through Adams and Jefferson administration. And then in the first weeks of the Adams administration, Congress passed a law saying that that money would be routed through the churches, and the churches would take over this function, because it's a Christian function. And that was James Madison's first veto. And he said, no, we are not going to give federal money to the churches. It will corrupt the churches, and this will establish a precedent. And he used the word precedent. This will establish a precedent of corrupting these churches. Not going to happen. So now we look back at this kind of naive debate that they were having about which is more dangerous, the churches taking over government or influencing government, or government funding the churches and thus making them, changing their essential nature and character. Both have happened. So.
Thom Hartmann is our guest. David is in Hobe Sound, Florida. David, please go ahead.
Hi, good afternoon, Peter.
Hey, David.
Sorry I missed you when I was in Washington. Anyway, anyhow, two things. Number one, at the beginning of the program, Mr. Hartmann, you mentioned that you started your talk show in reaction to Fox and talk radio. Well, you know, talk radio and Fox came into existence in reaction to NBC, CBS, and ABC having a monopoly on news distribution from the left. So let's go back to the beginning. All right, that's number one. Number two, I'd like you to contrast how conservative speakers are treated on campus these days with the way Bernie Sanders was treated at Liberty University. Not exactly a bastion of leftism when he spoke there. And I think that gives you a good insight, that those two, that contrast gives you a good insight to how liberals act these days.
Okay.
Mr. Hartmann.
I'm not sure what the question was. That's a nice creation story about the creation of Fox News. I don't think it's accurate, or you could say, you know, if you really think that facts are liberal, then yeah, the news is all liberal. And so, you know, if you want to promote something that's not facts, you know, like, hey, let's pretend that the climate's not warming up. You know, let's pretend that tobacco doesn't cause addiction or cancer. Which was, you know, a generation ago. But these kind of conservative positions. Let's pretend that the war in Vietnam was a wonderful thing. You know, if you want to have your own facts, and they're not really facts, fine. I think that one of the reasons why liberals generally do better on college campuses than conservatives is because many of the conservative positions are basically anti-science, anti-fact. I mean, you try and claim that the world is 6,000 years old, try to deny global climate change and global warming and the science behind that. The Republican Party in the United States is the only political party in the world that says the global warming isn't happening. Talk to the conservatives, and I've done it. I went to Denmark, spent a week there on Danish radio, interviewed the top conservative politicians in that country, and I'd say, okay, you're a conservative. You must deny that global warming is happening. No, we know it's happening. We got to do something about it. Oh, you're conservative. You must hate the national healthcare system, or the national single-payer healthcare system. Oh no, I don't want to do away with that. Oh, you're conservative. You must want to do away with the fact that when people want to go to college in Denmark, they actually get a $200 a month stipend, and tuition is free, you know, to help pay for books and rent and things. Oh no, I wouldn't do it. So then what makes you a conservative? And invariably the answer was, we don't want any more immigrants. That's the, you know, if you're a conservative in Europe, you're basically anti-immigrant. The other thing that concerns me, frankly, increasingly, is that politicians and media that identify themselves as conservative are really functionally shills for large corporations and very wealthy people. And the goal is to get the average working person to think and behave the opposite of his own best interest, to support Reaganism, to support NAFTA and CAFTA and SHAFTA and all this kind of stuff, which, you know, Bill Clinton played a big role in. This is bipartisan, but it was considered a conservative step, and it's destroyed the manufacturing base in America, which conservatives are delighted about. You know, the fact that wages have flattened out all these years. Russell Kirk in 1951 in The Conservative Mind, which is the Bible for the conservative movement. My father made me read that book when I was a kid, and it was fascinating. It was the book that started William F. Buckley going. Right? It's still in print. It's a very important book. To any conservative. Any conservative can recite chapter and verse from this book. And essentially in the book he said, you know, if this middle class, which is growing in 1951, if this middle class gets too big, then you're going to see social upheaval. You're going to see people who have been previously marginalized demanding rights, and it might even get violent. And everybody said, you know, this is the crazy right-wing fringe, right? And then in the 60s happened. In 1961, the birth control pill was legalized, came on the market by 65, 66, it was ubiquitous, it was very widespread, and that led to women having now significant control over their own bodies, saying, wait a minute, we would like equality in the workplace as well. You had the civil rights movement in the 1960s, African Americans saying we would like rights. You had the beginning of the gay rights movement, Stonewall and all that, and saying, what about us? And you had young people saying, hell no, I'm not going to go to Vietnam. Defying their elders, defying their own government, and which was exactly what Russell Kirk had predicted. And conservatives looked at this and said, oh my God, this is, and riots in response almost always to police violence in the inner cities and African-American parts of the cities. And, Watts, Detroit, they were all in flames. And the conservatives said, oh, Russell Kirk was right. We've got to reduce the size of the middle class, reduce the wealth of the middle class, so that people don't feel free to go out and riot. I mean, in '68, I was out in the streets in Grand River Avenue in East Lansing, Michigan, when the police were throwing tear gas grenades at us. And the essence of the whole thing was, I paid for my college tuition working as a part-time DJ making $2.35 an hour, at working as a dishwasher at Bob's Big Boy and changing tires and pumping gas at the local Exxon station, mostly in the summer. You could work your way through college. My wife worked her way through college working as a waitress at Howard Johnson's. So we felt empowered. If we were out in the streets protesting the policies of our government, we didn't feel that we would be wiped out, that the rest of our lives would be destroyed. Nowadays, if you got $20,000, $30,000 in college debt, you're only halfway through your college career, and you get in trouble for protesting, and suddenly now you've got a police record. Now you can't get credit. Now blah blah blah. It's like the lockdown of dissent in the United States has been driven in large part by economics since the 80s. This has been in my opinion, the essence of Reaganism, and you could say it has led to a more stable society, which was the conservative. The big classic difference between liberals and conservatives is that liberals suggest, and I'm going all the way back to John Locke and Thomas Jefferson, who said that the U.S. Constitution should be revised every 19 years, which is one generation. Liberals would say social change, if it's in a positive direction, should go forward, and it should go forward as fast as possible. And if we make mistakes, we'll fix those mistakes and keep going. Conservatives, on the other hand, as William F. Buckley famously said, a conservative is a man who stands astride the arc of history with his hand out shouting, stop. And conservatives are all in favor of positive social change, but they want it to go gradual, incremental, and not in a disruptive fashion. Both of those arguments, both of those worldviews are legitimate. What I think is the modern tragedy is that the word conservative has been hijacked to, as I said, my father was a conservative. He was a Dwight Eisenhower conservative. Dwight Eisenhower ran in 1956. You out there, go to your Google machine and look up 1956 Republican Party platform, right? Dwight Eisenhower ran for re-election on a platform that said, we have expanded Social Security. We've increased Social Security payments. We've added more than 2 million new people to Social Security. We've expanded union rights. We've added, X million new union members. We are, we're building the highway system across the country. We're building out our national infrastructure. I can't think, frankly, and this question's come up a couple of times. Bernie on my program a couple of years ago was talking about this, and he said, well, I don't want to quote Bernie, I'll quote myself. I can't think of any positions that Bernie is holding right now that Eisenhower wouldn't have supported. That's how much, see, I think America has always been an Eisenhower kind of country. Today that would be referred to as democratic socialism or center left or whatever. But I think both the Democratic and Republican parties have moved so far, and it's not even to the right, it's to the corporate side, to the billionaire side, to represent their interests, that the average working person is like, I'm screwed, here we are out in the middle of nothing. We've got nothing. So, and that's why I think, Bernie pulls 20% of the Republican vote in Vermont, reliably and predictably, because those are my dad Republicans. Those are the Eisenhower Republicans, the Republicans who get it, that, you know, if you have a healthy middle class, you have a healthy country.
We are talking on Book TV with author and radio talk show host Thom Hartmann. And his most recent books include Rebooting the American Dream, 11 Ways to Rebuild Our Country. The Thom Hartmann Reader came out in 2011. The Crash of 2016 came out in 2013 as well. The Last Hours of Humanity, Warming the World to Extinction, about global warming, also in 2013. The American Revolution of 1800, How Jefferson Rescued Democracy from Tyranny and Faction, and What This Means Today. 40th anniversary edition of that came out in 2014. And Death in the Pines, which happens to be a novel. Which
I wrote about 14, 15 years ago.
And just got published this year.
I got around to publishing.
Well, you've been talking about Bernie Sanders. We want to show our viewers a little bit of you interviewing or chatting with Senator Sanders on your show. Then we're going to show you Thom Hartmann's answers to Here Are a Few of My Favorite Things. And our show will continue live in just a few minutes.
I've said over and over again, I think you can boil the entire conservative economic agenda down to two words: cheap labor.
That's right. Cheap labor and defense of the largest corporations in this country and the wealthiest people. And I think that what we have got to do as a nation, and I know we're in the last days of a very intense campaign and all kinds of ads are going on the air, but I think we've got to calm down a little bit and just ask ourselves some very basic questions. And one of the questions, you know, that we want to ask? It's what Ronald Reagan asked in 1980. Remember
Are you better today than you were, better off today than you were 4 years ago?
Very simple question.
Yeah,
and the
simple.
answer to that is, for some people, for all of you out there who are millionaires and billionaires, if you're not concerned about the future of this country, you're not worried about your kids and your grandchildren, for your own economic reasons, I can understand that you're voting for George Bush. That is a rational decision. I think a bad one, but a rational decision. But if you are an ordinary working person, you have a president of the United States who has changed federal labor standards, the Federal Labor Standards Act, to throw 6 million workers off of overtime. That's you, friend. And you're going to vote for George Bush?
Thom Hartmann, who is Jack Vance and what is Shy or Chai?
Yeah, I'm not sure how it's pronounced. Jack Vance is a science fiction writer, in large part. He also used to write for Ellery Queen. He wrote detective novels, and he's written a lot of other things, but his science fiction is spectacular. And from the time I was able to read, I've been a science fiction junkie. And Jack Vance, he just recently passed away. His writing is of such an extraordinary caliber that I consider it literature, not just science fiction. I mean, it's just brilliant, brilliant writing. And I own every book he's ever written, and I'd been collecting his stuff from the time I was in my 20s. And when my ADD book was published in, what was it, 96 or thereabouts, Tim Underwood, who was the owner of Underwood Books, who published the book, was also publishing Jack Vance. And I didn't know that. And one day I was out on the West Coast, and Tim called, I was in the Bay Area, and Tim called me up and said, "Hey, I'm going over to Jack Vance's house for dinner. Would you like to join me?" And I mean, this is like 15, 20 years ago, some time ago. And I was like, "Wow, you know, Jack Vance." And so I went to dinner and got to know him and his wife Norma and his son John, and they're just amazing. And then when we were living in Atlanta at the time, when Jack went to Florida, he drove to Florida. He was becoming blind at that point in time. When he drove to Florida, or his wife drove him down to Florida to accept the Grand Master Science Fiction, or one of the top science fiction awards, they stopped at our house in Atlanta and stayed there for 3 days. And Jack, in my office, wrote actually wrote me into one of his last books. And I love Jack Vance's writing. One of your people had asked me, "What are you reading right now?" And I said, "Shy" by Jack Vance, and I'm rereading it probably for the 4th time, although it's been a decade since the last time I read it, so it seems all new again. Yeah.
Your publisher, for the most part, is a group called Barrett Kohler out of San Francisco.
Has published most of my economic and political books, although Hachette published The Crash of 2016 under their 12 imprint.
Uh-huh.
And
That was the only one that I could find. That
Random House published, or no, Random House published Last Hours of Ancient Sunlight. Focus Your Energy was published by Pocket Books, or by Penguin rather. I can't keep it all straight, I'm sorry.
Did you choose, I guess my question was, did you choose to go to Barrett Kohler for some reason?
It's a really good publishing company. My agent established our relationship with them, and I was really pleased that he did. Barrett Kohler even has a foundation that does good works, out of the profits from selling books. They're based in San Francisco, as I recall, and they just really care about books. They care about authors. They take good care of their authors. They keep books in print. They haven't gone full corporate like the big publishers have.
We asked you, what are your favorite books that you've written?
Mm.
What are they?
That I've written.
Right.
I think that probably a couple of the most consequential books that I've written that I have had or have the potential to have a lot of impact. Last Hours of Ancient Sunlight, which I wrote in the 90s, which is about ancient sunlight is oil. Oil was captured as sunlight 300 million years ago as plant material, settled in the ground, got compressed over time, and turned into oil. And it was about the end of the era of oil. And a book called Walking Your Blues Away, which is kind of a do-it-yourself psychotherapy book, in which, and doing the research for that, I discovered an astonishing thing about Sigmund Freud that I don't think anybody else has ever known. And I think that book has the potential to actually change a lot of psychotherapy, a lot of what's going on in that field.
What did you discover about Sigmund Freud?
Well, it goes back a little bit. When I studied NLP under Richard Bandler, who is the founder of NLP, and he wrote the introduction to a book about NLP and ADD called Healing ADD that I wrote. He talked about how when we have bad memories, painful memories, or any kind of memory actually, we store them in specific places. If I were to ask you, Peter, what color is the floor in your kitchen at home? What color is it?
It's wood.
Okay, so you just look down and to your right. So that's where you store that. There's a place in your brain that correlates with wherever your eyes go. Your eyes are actually, this is actually part of our brain that's physically available to us. The eyes are the only part of the brain that can reach the outside of the body. And they reflect activity going on in the brain. So a person may store this memory over here, and this memory over here, and another memory over here, and sometimes we store them just as feelings, in which case we tend to store them in here, or sometimes here, or whatever. And so what Richard had developed was a technique where you would move the location of the memory. He concluded that the place where the memory is stored is part of a giant filing system in the brain, and that the filing system actually has a method to it, and that the method is emotion. So we tend to store things in particular places based on the emotions. In other words, the brain sorts by emotion. And the way it works is when we fall asleep at night, there's a one-day scratch pad at the base of the brain. It's called the hippocampus, and it basically knows everything that happened today. The hippocampus does not know time beyond now or this day. That's all it knows. And at night when we sleep, when we dream, the hippocampus, or this is the most widely accepted theory about what goes on, the hippocampus is dumping the day's activities into the rest of the brain, the rest of the cortex, to process and to figure out what to keep, what to throw away, and where to store it. And we call this dreaming. And it seems inchoate and confusing and primal, but really it's the brain is sorting stuff by emotion, not by logic. And with post-traumatic stress disorder, what happens is somebody during the course of a day experiences something so horrible, the death of a comrade in war, a car accident, the people who were witnesses to the shooting in Oregon, the police officers who came and had to look at these awful bullet-riddled bodies. You go to sleep, and your hippocampus says, okay, here's what happened today, and the rest of the brain says, whoa, can't handle that. Just hang on to it for another day. And so you wake up the next day, and that memory is just as if it happened that day. And you talk to somebody with PTSD, and they'll say, 20 years ago, this happened to me, but I remember it like it was this morning. That's the one consistent clarion characteristic of true post-traumatic stress disorder. And so what Richard said was that memory in the hippocampus is associated with memories in the rest of the cortex. If you can start breaking those down into component pieces, the brain can absorb them, take them out of the hippocampus, and end the PTSD. And the way that he did it was he would say, okay, we'll take a memory and we'll just change it someplace. So change its location. So for example, if you can think of some minor irritation that you've had in the last couple of weeks, a waiter who treated you badly, something, a taxi driver who was a lousy, can you think of one?
Yes.
Okay. Where is it when you think of that memory? I'm not going to ask you what the memory is. I'm just asking you, where when you look at it, where is it?
It's right over here. Back over here again.
Yeah. Okay. So grab that picture and move it over there. And now make it black and white. Can you do that?
I don't know.
Okay. Is it
Probably
color,
not.
And run it backwards. But what happened? What Richard found was that. Now you're laughing. Does your feeling? Did you actually move to the picture?
No, not at all. I was just thinking.
All right.
You don't get to play talk show host on this program.
All right. Or psychologist, or psychotherapist. Yeah.
But that's very interesting.
The essence of it was that if you can get people to move their memories, that the meaning of those memories changes because they've gone to a different filing place. So this has gone from the filing place of god-awful, horrible experience into the filing place of, oh, that was kind of funny. And so, and the way that he would do this is he would have people move their eyes back and forth and back and forth. And it's also when your eyes cross the midpoint, you're shifting from one side of one hemisphere of the brain to the other hemisphere of the brain. And the hippocampus is like brainstem, so it's whole brain. But we've got a logical brain and an emotional brain essentially. I'm hyper simplifying, and the goal is to fully integrate these horrible memories so that they can be appropriately processed. So by moving the eyes back and forth across this center point, you are smearing the memory around the brain in a way that it can be dealt with. Okay? And typically its meaning changes. And so when I started digging into this, I discovered that Francine Shapiro has developed EMDR, emotional desensitization, reintegration, EMDR. It's been years since I wrote about it, and it's a technique that's used by the military where basically a person sits in front of another person and says, watch my finger while you're thinking about that horrible event. And things change, and they change very rapidly. I was demonstrating this at Steve Larson's place, the Stone Mountain Counseling Center, some years ago. And there was a fellow there who was one of Steve's patients who had been in Vietnam. He was a guy my age. He had been in Vietnam and was responsible for airlifting out people who were wounded. And they were on a mountain. There had been a horrible firefight. He was pretty sure that there were no Viet Cong around. He called in the rescue choppers. They came in, they landed, they loaded up. He looked around, said, okay, I think everything's fine, said take off. They got about 300 feet up in the air and a couple of missiles came out of the jungle and body parts rained down on him. And as he was trying to tell us this story, he just started sobbing uncontrollably. And in fact, he was on 100% disability. He had been unable to work for decades because he would just like 3 or 4 times a day just burst into tears because this memory was still today's memory. So I sat him down and I went through this move this thing around technique. I wasn't using the finger when I was just having him move it from place to place out here. And after about 4 2 or 3 minute rounds of doing this, suddenly he started laughing. And I said, why are you laughing? And he said, well, the memory just kind of lost its charge and became black and white. I mean, that happened like 30 years ago. And I'm just, it's funny how I've been torturing myself all these years for this. Suddenly he had a logical take on it. And this was like more than a decade ago, maybe 15 years ago. I got an email from him last year saying, I'm still fine. I'm back in the workforce, I'm doing fine. So I was wondering about the history of this. And I knew when I was a kid, I'd studied hypnosis. And hypnosis is part of NLP. Milton Erickson was probably one of the most famous medical hypnotists in the United States, a psychiatrist out of Phoenix. And part of NLP is modeled on his work. So I went back to the history of hypnosis. And it started with a guy named Franz Anton Mesmer back in the 1760s. Mesmer was an Austrian. And he discovered that if he used his finger, he'd run his finger back and forth with his patients, and he was able to solve what hysteria was the big issue back then, you know, which we would call PTSD today, I think, in large part. And it has all kinds of physical manifestations too. People with these conditions can be more physically vulnerable to things. He concluded that it was the moon. So the way that he did it was he would have one hand up in the air to gather energy from the moon, and then the other hand would be directing that energy into the person through their eyes. And he became incredibly famous. Ben Franklin went over to France, to Paris, the French Scientific Society. They invited Mesmer down. Mesmer taught this to Ben Franklin. They spent days working on this stuff. Mesmer had centers all over Europe for mesmerism. It was a big deal. And but he was promoting it as the moon, which seems kind of weird. In 1834, as I recall, there was a Scottish psychologist by the name of James Braid who said, this is nonsense, this moon stuff. This is nonsense. This just has to be eye fatigue or something like that. And I'm going to prove that it's got nothing to do with the person, because Mesmer was creating kind of this cult of personality. You had to be capable of getting the moon energy and all this kind of stuff. And he said, I'll do it with a pocket watch and prove, that it's got nothing to do with me. You just have a watch go back and forth. And it worked. And Braid named it neurohypnosis, and then the next year he shortened that to simple hypnosis, and that's where the word came from. Prior to that, it was called mesmerism. So then you follow the history of this this was 1834, through the 19th century, and I had studied Freud many, many years ago, and read Studies in Hysteria, the book that he and Joseph Brauer co-authored. It was his breakthrough book. It was what made Sigmund Freud famous. It was the story of Anna O, this one patient that they worked on. And in that book, and in numerous other papers, and I cite them in my book, Walking Your Blues Away, he said, I use hypnosis. I use it diagnostically, I use it therapeutically. He would use hypnosis to relax people. He would use hypnosis when they were telling their stories. And it was moving a finger back and forth in front of their face, or sometimes it was stroking left arm, right arm, left arm, right arm. But it was bilaterality. It was causing the brain to have to shift left brain, right brain, left brain, right brain, while experiencing or discussing trauma. And he was having fabulous success. And he wrote a book about it, Studies in Hysteria. And then in 1898, as I recall, suddenly Sigmund Freud stopped using hypnosis. Everybody stopped using hypnosis. And Freud started using cocaine, and for the next 6 or 7 years he was using cocaine. He wrote love poems to cocaine. That book is still in print. He was convinced that cocaine was the solution to everything, and then after a couple of years, his best friend died of a cocaine psychosis. He himself was starting to experience cocaine psychosis. He saw that it wasn't working, and then he came up with the Oedipus complex and the Electra complex in 1901, 1903, and said, no, it all has to do with your relationship with mother or father. And then he, in the early 1900s and teens, he developed this whole talk therapy thing. But he was never able to get that mojo back. He was never able to have the kind of success with patients that he was having in 1898. And when he finally committed suicide, he was, rather embittered and depressed and unhappy, and as people who go through years of Freudian therapy tend to get. And so I was wondering, why did he stop in 1898? And I started looking through the literature, and I couldn't find it anywhere. By coincidence, at that time, I was fascinated by a comment that Abraham Lincoln made to Harriet Beecher Stowe when he met her in 1861, I think it was. And she wrote Uncle Tom's Cabin in, as I recall, 1843 or 48. And it was the most widely sold, widely read book in the world, Uncle Tom's Cabin at the time. And he said, when he met her, he said, so you're the little lady who started the Civil War, which to a large extent had a grain of truth in it, anyway. So that got me curious as to what were the best-selling books of the 19th century. I just, maybe I'd like to go back and read a couple of them. And there was this book published in 1898 by Georges de Mouillet, who had also, I think he wrote the three Musketeers. I might be wrong. But anyhow, he had written this book, and this book was the second best-selling book in the entire 19th century worldwide. It was called Trilby. Most people today, you say Trilby, they go, huh? George de Meulière, who's this guy? But everybody was reading it. And the story of Trilby was the story of the 16-year-old girl in France, in Paris, who was a model in an art studio. And the artists, there were 4 artists who had this little art studio. And one of them was, according to the book, an archetypical Jew. This was the phrase that de Meulière used to describe this character. And he's described as a very negative character. It's a very anti-Semitic description. And this man knew hypnosis. Using the James Braid, use a pocket watch or your finger hypnosis. And he hypnotized this young woman, her name was Trilby, and taught her how to sing. And they went on a world tour. And he would hypnotize her at night. She'd go on stage. She would sing better than anybody ever sang in the history of the world. Audiences loved it. He would take all the money. He would take her back to the room, still in a state of hypnosis, exploit her sexually, and then in the morning she'd wake up with no memory and tormented by, what's going on here. And at the end of the book, she finally figures out what's going on, breaks the psychic bond with this man, and both of them die because the bond was so like that, right? His name was Svengali, the bad guy, which is where that word came from. So, and the principal readers of this book were women, particularly upper income women in the developed world. And probably 95% of Sigmund Freud's patients were women. So now, and in the book, in Trilby, he describes, it's a 1.5-page description of a trance induction. And it was exactly the technique that Sigmund Freud was using. So these women read this book. Oh my God, if somebody hypnotizes you, they can steal your soul and make you do all these things. All these horrible things will happen. And then one of these women walks into the office of a Jewish psychiatrist who says, sit down and follow my finger. And they run out screaming, right? So as a result, in my opinion, and I have nothing other than the historical timeline to back this up, but hypnotism just vanished in 1898. And because, I believe, of Trilby. And it took 70 years for it to come back. It was in the 1950s that Milton Erickson started, really aggressively promoting medical hypnotism in the United States. So the technique, at that time, I was teaching NLP, and I had and I was doing a kind of a consulting practice over the telephone, mostly with psychologists, psychiatrists, psychotherapists, and doing workshops all around the world on this. And I started with many of the therapists who would call me up and say, okay, how do I do this with that? How do I use NLP with this situation? I say, instead of paying me my hourly rate, if you would ask some of your patients to just try something really simple and let me know what happens, I'd appreciate it. Have them go for a walk. Let me back up just a little bit. My first question that started this whole thing was, PTSD isn't new, right? 10,000 years ago, you and me are Og and Zog, and we go out to hunt the woolly mammoth, and the woolly mammoth decides to take out Zog, right? Og is going to be pretty bummed out and pretty traumatized, but he's got to walk 5 miles back to the tribe. So could it be that the process of walking, left foot, right foot, right foot, and the opposite hand swinging, this is bilateral, that the process of walking itself was a way to heal the brain? Because we are self-healing mechanisms. If we cut ourselves, I had a cut of the back, it's all healed up now. There was a scar here from my cat just a week ago, and bright red and everything, and now it's all healed up. So why wouldn't our brain be self-healing? And what would the mechanism be? And maybe that mechanism is walking, because it's bilateral. So I said, have your patients just go for a 20-minute walk every day, and while they're walking with nothing in their hands, think about the crisis that they're dealing with. And what I started getting back from these folks was, we're seeing really rapid clinical resolutions of intractable issues, particularly PTSD. And so, at that point I was like, okay, I got to share this story. So I wrote the book, Walking Your Blues Away. And now you know the whole book, you don't even need to buy it. But it's basically how to, kind of do-it-yourself psychotherapy.
We have a little over an hour left with our guest, Thom Hartmann, here on Book TV. 202 is the area code, 748-8200 for those of you in the East and Central time zones, 748-8201 if you live in the Mountain and Pacific. You can send Mr. Hartmann a text message as well, 202-717-9684. We'll also show you all the different ways via social media you can get a hold of us here. Larry, Centralia, Washington, thanks for holding. You are on with author Thom Hartmann.
Yes, Thom Hartmann, what an honor to speak with you. I'm older than Bernie Sanders, so give the kid a chance.
Yeah, there you go.
I used to listen to you in Portland, Oregon when you were living there and in the Selwood district.
Yep.
But anyway, I was wondering, I hear comments from the cerebrally vacuous Sarah Palin saying that Bernie Sanders is a socialist, and we're supposed to think socialist is next to communist, and that it's a bad word. Well, half the country already is a socialist. If you look around, especially Sarah Palin, she gets oil money from the oil companies. But anyway, I think a good society is a blend of the two, socialism and capitalism, because not everything has to be for profit. And the other thing I wonder is why we never see the war machinery rolling off assembly lines.
Larry, what do you do? Larry, what are you retired from?
The barber.
Thank you, sir. Have your political views over the years differed? Have you changed?
Yes, I used to say there wasn't a nickel's worth of difference between Republicans and Democrats, and that was I grew up under FDR and Harry Truman and then Eisenhower, and I thought they were pretty equal parties, but I think they've all shifted so far to the right that the Republicans have gone into insanity, and the Democrats have gone into the real Republican mode.
Thank you, sir, for calling in today.
Yeah. The socialist canard is an interesting one. If you believe in having Social Security, you are a socialist. If you believe in having free public education, you're a socialist. If you believe, or at least a democratic socialist, which is what Bernie calls himself. If you believe in public streets, you're a socialist. I mean, America was founded on socialist and semi-socialist values as well as free market values. The kind of democratic socialism that Bernie talks about is, let's clearly define what is the public sphere and what is the private sphere. Now, the problem with the word is that the Soviet Union called themselves the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics, the USSR. And so people of my generation think socialist means Soviet Union. They were appropriating the term. They were not even good communism. They were basically, Joe Stalin and Vladimir Lenin were strongmen, in a essentially a dictatorship of sorts, and so, that's not socialism. It's democratic socialism. Democratic socialism is what we have here in a modest amount, and what the caller was referring to, Sarah Palin. In Alaska, they have the Alaska Permanent Fund. And every year that Sarah Palin was governor, she would authorize a check in the neighborhood of $2,000 or $3,000 a year to every man, woman, and child in Alaska that came out of the interest that the Permanent Fund was drawing on. And the Permanent Fund got that money from saying, if you're going to drill oil out of Alaskan land, you're going to pay us for that oil. And not a huge price, but enough of a price that we got the Permanent Fund. And so it's a guaranteed minimum income in Alaska, which is even beyond what most socialists would propose, that Sarah Palin is an advocate of, or has been historically. I wouldn't call her intellectually challenged. I think she's a smart woman, but in any case. So I think that the word socialist is losing its sting in large part as a consequence of Bernie's candidacy. And it is stimulating a really fascinating conversation in America about where is that dividing line between public and private. In other words, it used to be, prior to the Reagan era, it was conventional wisdom that the public sector, the government sector, this is what we all collectively own, it's what we all collectively administer, and it should be done for the good of all. And it should only be done in those areas that are natural monopolies or appropriate government functions as defined by the Constitution. In other words, we have a military. So it's the most socialist of all institutions. They provide housing, medical care, clothing, everything, food. So that's something, it's in the Constitution. We're going to have a military. We're going to have roads. It's in Article 1, Section 8. We're going to, these public schools are not in the Constitution, but this is something that we decided to do, and we got more socialist over time. On the other hand, I don't think any American wants to be buying their blue jeans or their shoes or their computer from a government-owned factory. You know, that would be communism. Communism is government control of the means of supply and distribution. We don't want that. Nobody wants that. I do think, though, that we have wandered now, as a consequence in large part of this kind of Reaganistic theory that government can do no right and that the private sector always does right, which is, both of those canards are demonstrably false. We've wandered into the area of privatizing things that shouldn't have been privatized. You've got, you know, the EPA having to hire a private for-profit contractor to look into the old gold mine, you know, where they had the spill into the Animas River a couple of months ago. You know, what's a for-profit company doing that kind of stuff for? For-profit companies are incorporated first and foremost to make money, which means that that company is going to be looking for every corner that they can cut. You know, I'm not sure with really dangerous stuff like cleaning up mine sites that we should be having it being done that way. It should be done by somebody whose first commitment is to cleaning up mine sites, which would be a nonprofit corporation if you're going to outsource it, or would be government employees. But the government employees of the EPA have been steadily cut over the years, or at least the size that it should be now is considerably smaller than what it is. And so they've had to outsource these things. Same thing with our military. We're outsourcing things. And so you end up with the Ed Snowdens of the world. I mean, he didn't work for the government. He worked for a private corporation that was taking money from the government to do what should be a government function. So number one, I think that we've, just speaking for myself, I think that we've gone way too far in this whole privatization mania, and there are things that the government actually can do well and does do well that we should be encouraging the government to do. And number two, we should be looking at this area of natural monopolies. How many power companies can bring power to your house? One. How many companies can bring cable TV into your house? Typically one. How many, or telephone service into your house? Typically one. So it's septic coming out of your house, the sewage coming, and the water coming into your house. These are all natural monopolies. You don't have 5 power lines coming into your house so you can pick which one you're going to buy from today based on the free market. So if these are going to be natural monopolies, then they should either be not-for-profit corporations or they should be government entities. About half the electricity generated in the United States is generated by community-owned power centers. They're consistently higher reliability, higher performance, lower cost than the for-profit ones because they don't have to skim 20% off the top to pay their CEOs millions of dollars. They don't have to skim money off the top to give to their stockholders for dividends. And because their mission statement is not, we're here to make money, their mission statement is, we're here to make sure that you've got reliable electricity. And when I lived in Portland, for example, PGE, which had been spun off from Enron, was selling itself. And the city of Portland wanted to buy it, and they offered the asking price. And PGE said, no, we will not sell it to a government entity. We will only sell it to another private entity. They were, you know, so locked into this mindset of only the free market, in quotes. I'm a total free marketer, as you mentioned in the beginning of the show. I'm a serial capitalist or a serial entrepreneur. I'm not a serial capitalist. And I think that, you know, it's time for us to have that conversation. You know, have we gone too far? Is it time for us to really start looking at the fundamental principles of how we organize our economy and how we organize our way of life? By the way, the distinction between capitalism and free enterprise is an important one. I get people calling into the show all the time, usually conservatives who don't understand what conservative means. They call themselves conservatives. And they'll say, well, I'm a capitalist. And I'm like, really? How much money did you make from your investments last year? Oh, you know, $35 on my IRA or something. You know, well, then you're not a capitalist. Capitalists are people who live off capital. Literally. Capitalist is a person who invests their money and lives off their investment. And somewhere back in the last 50 years, we decided that that was such a noble thing that we would give them a different tax rate than people like you and me who work for a living. And so, you know, you or I could run up against a 39% tax rate. Capitalists right now have a maximum 20% capital gains tax. So their income hits a ceiling at 20%, you know, whereas a brain surgeon's income hits a ceiling at 39%. This makes no sense to me. This is crazy. And in fact, Ronald Reagan said it was crazy. He said, you know, do you think that a millionaire should be paying a lower income tax rate than a bus driver? And he was speaking at a high school, and the kids all yelled, no. And he said, you're right, they shouldn't. And for 1 year during the Reagan administration, the capital gains tax and the ordinary income tax were identical, 28% for 1 year. And then the corporations got the better of Reagan, and the split broke back out again. I think that was 83 or 84. So, you know, there's really not that many capitalists in the United States. There's probably fewer than a couple 100,000 people who are literally living, other than retired people, who are literally living off their investments, who put money into companies and then just live off that.
From your book, Screwed, Mr. Hartmann, Larry from Centralia said he didn't see a dime's worth of difference between the parties. You asked the question, what about creating a third party?
Yeah. I think I've, I don't remember what I wrote about third parties in Screwed, because it's been more than a decade since I wrote that book, or in the neighborhood of a decade. But one thing that I do believe right now, and this is why I think Bernie's candidacy is so noble, is that, I mean, you look at, it's not true that Ralph Nader cost Al Gore the election in 2000, but it is widely believed. But typically what happens is third parties end up harming the party, the mainstream party that's closest to them, because they siphon votes away from them. So Bernie says, you know, I'm going to run in the Democratic primary, and if I don't get it, I'm not going to run. And, you know, God bless him, that's the way to do it. What did I say?
Alternative parties have an important place in American politics, you write, and those in them should continue to work for their strength and vitality. They're essential as incubators of ideas and nexus points for activism. That does not mean, however, that they are an alternative to the two mainstream parties when election time rolls around.
Yeah, so I'm consistent in my philosophy. I think the Green Party and the Libertarian Party are great in that they stir conversations on the edges that move then into the major parties. On the other hand, I don't think it's great when a politician of, say, you could do it Republican or Democrat, but a district that really typically would vote Democratic ends up with a Republican member of Congress because the Green Party was real active in that district. Or a district that would typically elect a Republican to Congress ends up with a Democrat because the Libertarian Party was super active in that district. You know, at the level of the vote, it becomes problematic. At the level of ideas, good stuff.
Scott in San Diego, please go ahead with your question or comment for Thom Hartmann.
Yeah, good morning, Peter. Good morning, Tom. And good morning, C-SPAN. Tom, you're the brightest guy on talk radio today. You've got heart and you've got smarts, which are two things that are in very short supply in what passes for political discourse today. So here's my question. Your association with Bernie Sanders as a radio guest goes back decades when he was beginning in local politics back in Vermont. So it's safe to say that you've gotten to know him pretty well as a politician and as a human being. So what is something about Senator Sanders that most voters don't know, that if they did know it, they would understand why he'd make an awesome president? And also, as of right now, how would you gauge his chances of being nominated and elected?
Okay. With regard to his chances, I just don't know. It's, you know, these things are very, very difficult to predict. With regard to who is Bernie, I'll just tell you a quick story. When we were first talking about Bernie being on our show, he had been on the program a couple of times, and we were thinking about making it a regular feature of the show, which is a real break in the format of my show. The format of, because basically, you know, Bernie becomes the show for an hour. And usually it's callers calling me, and instead it's callers calling Bernie, and I'm just playing MC. So we were going to get together in Burlington and talk about this, and just have a conversation. So Louise and I show up at the restaurant, and Bernie's guy, I think it was Huck, shows up. And Bernie comes in, you know, like a whirlwind, you know, with his hair askew and, you know, and on the phone, right? And we're sitting there, and he kind of comes over and kind of half sits down, and he says, "Really? Oh, okay. I'll be there. I'll be there in 30 minutes. Don't worry. I will be there." And he hangs up the phone, and this waitress is walking by, and he doesn't physically grab it, but he grabs the waitress and he says, "Bring me something with chicken." And she's like, "What?" And he says, right now, I gotta run." And so she runs off to the kitchen, and we just sat down, right? And he says, "IBM just announced they're laying off 300 people. We're assembling a group this is 7 o'clock at night, right? We're assembling a group of people in front of their factory in a half hour for a demonstration. I've got to be there." He was the congressman from Vermont. That was the one and only time I've ever had a meal with Bernie. I mean, you know, Bernie is all business. You know, I don't know Bernie as a human being individually beyond the many conversations that we've had, but I've never been to his home. I don't know his family. It's not, Bernie is so committed to his work and to his nation that it always seems to come first, at least from what I can see.
Catherine, Ormond Beach, Florida. Good afternoon to you.
Yes, wonderful show. Like most Americans, I support common sense gun regulations, but I believe our forefathers...
Do you know what? I'm going to hang up on Catherine only because Catherine calls in all the time, has different names, and always talks about the same issue. She doesn't really add to the conversation that we like to have with our guests, but I apologize for that.
Right.
Tom's in Chicopee, Massachusetts. Hi, Tom.
Yeah, how are you? C-SPAN, it's great. I love C-SPAN.
Me too.
And I like all the different perspectives, whatever. And Tom, I really enjoy listening to you. Anyway, I guess my thought here is I think over the years I've become more conservative. And
what does that mean?
Well, for me, meaning, for example, I find liberals to be much more bigoted. You know, when you talk about multicultural, et cetera,
so conservative.
Anybody on the right.
So conservative to you means that you've become more tolerant of and want to be more inclusive with regard to people of color.
Well, I've always felt that way. In fact, for example, myself, I mean, I lived in Africa for a couple of years. I was a volunteer at a time when the Peace Corps was kicked out of Tanzania. I was a volunteer there. And, you know, I mean, and, you know, and I've been around, done some traveling, whatever, and I really do enjoy people, and I like to see people do well. But I think maybe the biggest thing, because there's so much to talk about, but that I found I've just gotten a little more conservative about my opinions. For example, I didn't like, what's her name, Hersey Alley, not being allowed to speak at Brandeis University. I thought that was terrible. She has an experience that needs to be heard.
I don't know who that is or what you're talking about, so I can't speak to it.
So, Tom, in Chicopee, Massachusetts, do you listen to Thom Hartmann's radio show?
No, I haven't.
Okay.
Did you have a specific question?
And that's why I'm glad I'm listening to him speak this afternoon. And
all right. Well, we appreciate your listening, and I want to follow that up with this email from Pam in Birmingham, Alabama, and this might be part of it. An earlier caller mentioned NAFTA passed during a Democratic administration, so it seems it makes no difference which party is in power. That makes people get cynical about the system. Here I am, a Democrat in a red state. What can we do to change minds and hearts?
This is a real problem for the Democratic Party. Al Fromm talks about this in his book from a couple of years ago, how back in the late 80s, in fact, rather than quoting Al Fromm, let me just put this in my own words. Reagan had declared war on organized labor in '81, busting up Patco and, you know, all these things, appointing the first anti-labor Secretary of Labor in the history of the United States, and et cetera. And as labor was collapsing in their asset base, as unions were getting smaller, they were also getting less wealthy, and unions had traditionally been a large source of money for the Democratic Party. And so so some strategic Democrats like Al Fromm were looking around going, okay, the union money's going away, what's next? How do we survive as a political party? The Republicans have survived as a political party basically by being on the side of big business. And, it's the party of business. And back when what was good for General Motors was good for America, you could argue that was even a good thing. But the Democrats had been the party of labor. So now we can't be labor anymore. What do you do? Well, there's some businesses out there that are less toxic than others. So instead of being the party of the tobacco industry, which the Republicans were firmly in the pocket of back in the 80s, let's become the party of the banks. They're not toxic, and they got a lot of money. Let's become the party of big business, but softer businesses, businesses that everybody respects. And so the Democratic Party, through the Democratic Leadership Council and the Third Way and all this kind of stuff, and Al Fromm in his book talks about going down to Arkansas when Bill Clinton was governor and sitting him down and saying, you want to join me in this thing? We're gonna take over the Democratic Party. We're going to rebrand it essentially, and I'll make you president. And that's what happened. And the Democratic Party has become, by and large, since 1991 or 92, has become the party of some big businesses. And this is where Bernie Sanders is making a turn away from this and saying, no, we're not going to be the party of any business. We're going to be the party of the people of the United States. Let the Republicans be the party of the billionaires and be the party of the big corporations. That's why I asked Tom, what being a conservative meant to him, because when you ask people this, sometimes they'll say, well, I'm opposed to abortion. Well, I don't know if that's a conservative or liberal position. Or, I've got 4 guns and I don't want to give them up. Well, I'm not sure that's, how did these become partisan issues? These should be issues that we discuss, opposed to abortion. I'm a evangelical Christian. What does that have to do with politics? So what has happened is that the party which is representing a very small slice and doing a very good job of representing that very small slice of the 1% in America can't get elected. The Republican Party can't get elected if they were simply to say, we are the party of the billionaires, we are the party of the transnational corporations. NAFTA, for example, was passed. Yes, it was signed by Bill Clinton, but it was mostly Republicans who voted for it. The Democrats were very opposed to it. And we're going to be if they simply said, we're the party of big business, nobody would vote for them. So instead they go, okay, you got 15 million evangelical Christians, we'll pick them up. You got 20 million homophobes, we'll pick them up. You got 100 million racists, we'll pick them up. You got 30 million people who hate abortion, we'll pick them up. In other words, they take these issues that don't hurt big business at all, that the billionaires don't give a rat's patootie about, and say, we'll take strong positions with these groups, and we'll pick it. And so it's become essentially a coalition. It's sort of like the way that parliamentary governments are governed, with coalition. And I think that thus people say, okay, well, I guess if I'm opposed to abortion or if I'm an evangelical Christian or whatever, I must be therefore a Republican because the Republican Party has told me that over and over again. And I think it's an unfortunate bifurcation in our politics, an unnecessary one. And the Democratic Party has, once they started selling out to big corporations in the 90s, they didn't stop. And although the Progressive Caucus in the Democratic Party is the largest or second largest caucus in the U.S. Congress, they still are consistently marginalized by the corporate Democrats. And my sense of it, and I write about this in the crash of 2016, although not so much at the level of party, is that a good-sized economic crisis might shake up the Democratic Party enough that they go back to their FDR, Harry Truman, frankly, Lyndon Johnson roots, Jack Kennedy.
This is a quote that you called the most profound comment I've ever heard about foreign policy and human nature. I don't know why America always thinks she has to run around the world, forcing people to take our way of governance at the barrel of a gun. When you got something really good and you don't have to force it on people, they will steal it.
Yeah, I was, Dick Gregory and I were flying to Uganda during the war with Idi Amin, and the international charity organization that I mentioned set up a program there, which is still there, it's still running. Salem International is the website to see it, .org. And we started talking politics, and he made that comment to me. And he says, and only he said it with the perfect comedian's timing, When you got something good, you don't have to force it on people with the barrel of a gun. They will steal it. It's like, and that's what's happening. Countries that are flipping small d democratic, they are stealing back their countries. The people are rising up and saying, we want our country back. Yeah, it's a brilliant statement. And it's one of the chapters in Rebooting the American Dream is titled, They Will Steal It, and it's based on that comment. It's a call for us to recalibrate our foreign policy.
Linda's in Phoenix. Hi, Linda.
Hi. I'll be as quick as I can. Talking about the both Democratic and Republican parties, and also little earlier, you said that the extremes were moving more towards the corporations, and that brought to mind, to me, a quote from Mussolini: "Fascism should be more appropriate, should more appropriately be called corporatism, because it is a merger of state and corporate power." And by the way, I feel the burn. I'm a big supporter.
Great.
And I'm a political junkie, and this just doesn't leave my mind.
Yeah. So your question
scares
is?
Me greatly, and I wanted to know if you would comment on that, and also what you think of the TPP.
Yeah, I'd be glad to. The TPP, I call it the Southern Hemisphere, or the Southern Hemisphere Asian Free Trade Agreement, SHAFTA. So we've got NAFTA, CAFTA, and SHAFTA. And I prefer to call the TPP SHAFTA, because it really is the Southern Hemisphere Asian Free Trade Agreement. And, you know, I'm opposed to all of them. So the fascism part, yeah. This is a word that was invented actually by Giovanni Gentile, who was Mussolini's speechwriter and ghostwriter, but and who probably was the origin of that quote. But it's certainly Mussolini said that repeatedly, and in fact, when Mussolini took over Italy, they dissolved the parliament, and instead of having what would be our equivalent of congressional districts elect their representatives to the parliament, the largest corporation in each district sent their representative to Parliament. So literally, and in fact he renamed it. He called it the Cameo de Fascisio Corporationes. Forgive my lousy Italian, but it's the chamber of the fascist corporations. And this merger of corporate and state interest. Henry Wallace wrote about this in 1940, as I recall, 44. The New York Times asked him, "What about American fascists?" And he wrote a brilliant piece in the New York Times in which he said that the fascists you have to worry about are not the neo-Nazis. The fascists you have to worry about are the corporate powers that are reaching out for control of our government, because they already control the economy. And if they can then control the agency which makes the rules for the economy, they will have unlimited power. And that is a danger, and that is fascism. This was the Vice President of the United States in the early 1940s in the New York Times. And I think that, you know, he was prescient. It's gotten worse over time. I just don't like using the word fascism because people think you're talking about Nazism. And the Nazis were a death cult. They were not even functionally fascist. So,
what would be the effect, in your view, of TPP?
It's essentially a fascist argument. I mean, you get these tribunals, these three-judge tribunals that are made up of corporate lawyers who have the power to override laws made here in the United States. We already saw this with NAFTA, for example. Back 30 years ago, the Humane Society of the United States started a campaign. It took 24 years to do it, to change the way that tuna were fished. Tuna typically swim underneath, schools of tuna swim underneath schools of dolphins. The dolphins are air breathers. They swim on the surface. They're messy eaters. They eat something, the stuff filters down, and the tuna eat it. So they're eating the leftovers of the dolphins above them. And so they would come in with these giant nets. Wherever they saw dolphins, they knew there were tuna below. They'd take these giant nets, and they'd pull them all up, and the dolphins would all die. And, so the Humane Society said, let's require long line fishing, like with the fishing pole kind of fishing. You can have 1,000 lines, but below the dolphins, down where the tuna are. We made this law in the United States. Dolphin-safe tuna. It's a major accomplishment. And it was made a law as a result of the public, the vast majority of the public, saying, this is what we want. Right? We're concerned about the future of the dolphins. Their populations are diminishing. They're mammals. They're smart. They're like us in some ways. Let's have humane fishing. As soon as we signed NAFTA, fishermen in Mexico, which were still using the purse-seine nets, sued us and said, you can't have that law. That's an unfair restraint of trade. It means that our product, our tuna caught off the shores of Mexico, cannot be sold in the United States. That's a violation of the North American Free Trade Agreement and the World Trade Organization rules. And we had to back down. We had to change our laws. I mean, there's hundreds of examples of this. That's probably one of the more famous ones. TPP will do the same thing, only with pharmaceuticals, with banking. Basically, the lowest common denominator, most corporate friendly, least good for the consumer policies are going to become law that is enforced by the corporations themselves in courts that are run and owned by the corporations themselves that have the power to overturn United States lawmaking. In my opinion, any conservative should be saying, hey, wait a minute, this is so wrong. I mean, the conservative argument against the United Nations was that a surrender of sovereignty. And it was. We literally gave up our right to be able to start a war just because we decided we wanted to do it, and said we will not enter a war without the body of nations saying, yes, you can do that. And we've stood there all these years. Conservatives said, wait a minute, you're surrendering sovereignty to the rest of the world. That's wrong. We are the United States. We answer only to ourselves. And yet now many of those same people are saying, oh yeah, but TPP, NAFTA, SHAFTA, CAFTA, all of them, they're just fine. It's wonderful stuff. And that's my point about how conservative no longer means conservative. It no longer means defending the Constitution. It means now defending the interests of big transnational corporations and billionaires. And then they put this patina on it to make it seem like the average guy could vote for them. And it's the only way that they can win elections, unfortunately.
This text, please tell us the name of Tom's book about EMDR. I caught his discussion and want to buy it.
It's called Walking Your Blues Away.
There you go. Nancy, Redondo Beach, California.
Thank you, Peter, and thank you, Tom. I just love you and enjoy you so much. My question is, what can the average person like me do to really change things about what's going on in the middle class? Nothing theoretical, just a step-by-step. I email, I protest, and I still feel like I'm in the same place. So I'm just wondering what an average person can do to change things. And I'll take the answer off the air.
Thank you very much. I think that it was Thorsten Veblen, the Norwegian economist, as I'm recalling, it's been a lot of years, who suggested, and I think McDowell in The Tipping Point reprised some of this, who suggested that when a certain percentage, and it seems to be in the neighborhood of 20-25% of the population, firmly believes something that's outside the mainstream of how the society is going, that the society will change to accommodate that new belief. And I think we certainly saw this with the Reagan Revolution. It was not a majority of Americans who agreed that we should cut taxes on billionaires and cut taxes on corporations and raise taxes 18 times on average working people, as Reagan did. It was a small group of people, but they were able to convince enough people, that 20-25%, to basically flip our government. So I think the thing that you can do to most effectively change things is wake people up. Have conversations with your friends, whether it's on the telephone, whether it's over coffee in your kitchen, whether it's at the local community center, whether it's on Facebook or Twitter or your favorite website. Educate your friends and your neighbors. Let people know. If everybody, on either side, frankly, I mean, I would say the same thing to Republicans of goodwill. We all should become, evangelists is perhaps too strong the word, but awakeners, educators. And when you actually have the facts on your side, it's fun and easy.
Hi, Tom. My name is Kelly. Text message. I was wondering if you would talk a little about your vegetarianism. Love your show on Sirius.
Yeah. I became a vegetarian when I was 16, so that would have been 67, in response to the Vietnam War originally. It was a statement of nonviolence. And within a year of that, I had gotten into TM and other spiritual practices that led me to conclude that vegetarianism was also a more ethical way of living. And then I started reading the literature on vegetarianism and decided that it was probably a healthier way of eating. And so, I've been a vegetarian ever since then, and mostly these days a vegan. I think that you can make an argument that eating small fatty fish periodically, like once a week. There was a study that was just done a couple of months ago that you can find. Actually, I'm not sure that the website, but anyhow, they found, it was a study of Nordic populations, and they found that the people who ate small fatty fish, one serving once a week or more, had better cognitive abilities as they aged past 50 than the people who ate none at all. So if somebody was eating for maximum health, that would be the one caveat I would put on it, which I'm sure has got every vegetarian and vegan in the country going, no! But, you know, kippered herring, sardines, that kind of thing, these small fatty fish that are not high on the food chain, they're not filled with mercury and poisons. But that's the only caveat. I feel great, you know, and we raised our kids vegetarian. I've seen it. It works, and it's walking lightly on the earth too. You know, I think there's something to be said for food density. The more a food is, you know, like you take 100 pounds of grain and you run it through a cow and you end up with a pound of beef. I think that's denser food, and as we've shifted to denser and denser food over the last couple of decades, mostly with fast foods, but you know, we're starting to have weight problems, and I suspect that there's something there too. When I eat vegan, I feel lighter. It feels better to me.
Who is Master Stanley?
Master Stanley, I said other spiritual practices. Master Stanley was a fellow who was he was the pastor of the Coptic temple in Detroit at 456 Ledyard Street in downtown Detroit. It used to be the governor's mansion back in the 1920s, and a big old building. And I became his student when I was 17. Went through a couple of years of kind of learning the stuff. You know, this is a Christian organization that had some very loose ties to the Orthodox Coptic Church in Egypt, but very, very loose. It was Hamid Bey actually started it, and he came to the United States in the 1920s, and him and Paramahansa Yogananda did tours around the country. He could stop his heart and stuff, and he was on You Asked For It, a famous TV show where he died and brought back to life and stuff. And Master Stanley prescribed vegetarianism. He was a big fan of it for spiritual practice. And, you know, so I got into that. And then when Master Stanley died for a couple of years, John Davis and I and a couple of other people I was one of the rotating pastors for that church. So I was ordained. I've done a bunch of weddings and things over the years, but yeah.
So are you a Coptic Christian today?
If I had to choose an affiliation, sure. Yeah.
And what is the difference between mainstream Christianity and Coptic Christianity?
Well, the Master Stanley's Coptic organization it's based in Grand Rapids. John Davis is running it, who was along with me and a group of about 12 other people were kind of hardcore disciples of Master Stanley's, has become more like Unity, like the more progressive denominations that are willing to entertain things like meditation and vegetarianism. So it's not the let's dress up and look all pompous like the official Orthodox Coptic Church. Hamid Bey was an Orthodox priest who went rogue.
Eric is calling in from Erie, PA. Hi, Eric.
Good morning or afternoon, gentlemen. Tom, it's Lawsuit Eric in Erie. I'd love to have you in this forum here with where we get to discuss your books at length and get off the daily politics. I wanted to know what maybe your takeaway is on, now that we've got a lot of years of data, on these ADD, ADHD boys that were heavily medicated in a kind of a knee-jerk reaction. I was one of them in the 70s. And what we've seen in the manifestations in their later life, particularly relating to ways they seek to balance their own brain chemistry later, self-medication, depression, things like that. What's your takeaway in terms of that? And also, I carry the message, man. Whenever I encounter a kid that's getting the ADD rap, I take them aside and I say, listen, this is an advantage. There's something you can do. You can do a lot of things that nobody can do. Sure, maybe you can't do a couple things that everyone can do, but you've got powers that they don't have. So find those, use those.
Yeah, it is excellent questions. Consequences of meds and school. Okay, here's first of all my hypothesis on ADD. When my son went through this, it provoked this, sort of like with the hypnosis stuff. How did this happen? Where did this come from? What's going on with this? And it occurred to me that prior to the agricultural revolution, which was only 10 or 11,000 years ago, we were all hunter-gatherers. And in a hunting-gathering society, ADD is characterized by three principal behaviors: distractibility, impulsivity, and a need for high levels of stimulation, high levels of arousal. So in school, we view those things, the distractibility, the kid's looking at the bug on the ceiling instead of listening to the teacher. Impulsivity, the kid is interrupting people and blurting things out. Need for high level of stimulation, the kid is constantly getting into trouble, or he's figuring out ways to be stimulated, basically. And it's behavior that we try to crush in schools historically. But if we were in a hunting-gathering society and we're going through the forest looking for lunch, and we're not constantly scanning the environment, we might miss that rabbit that just ran by that's going to be lunch, or we might miss that bear back there that wants to make us lunch. So distractibility would be an asset in that world. Impulsivity, you're chasing a deer through the forest, or you're chasing a rabbit through the forest and a deer runs by. What do? Go after the deer, go after the rabbit. Oh, let's sit down and make a graph here, and on one side we'll put deer, the other side we'll put rabbit, well, assets and liabilities. Let's say the deer is more meat, but he's going to be harder to catch. No, you don't have time for that, right? You have to make an instant decision and act on it. And literally the textbook and dictionary definition of impulsivity is behavior preceding cognition. In other words, we act before we think about it. That would be an asset in that world, not a liability. And the need for high levels of stimulation and arousal. Well, who's going to get up in the morning and say, I think I'll go out there in the jungle or in the forest where there are things that want to eat me as much as I want to eat them and find lunch, right? What kind of person would do that? Somebody who is not intimidated by high levels of arousal. In fact, the best hunters would be the people who love that. Oh boy, adventure. Right? So that's ADD. Those are hunters, right? Hunter-gatherers. But then, when the farming revolution came along, those skills are the opposite of what you need in farmers. Once you settle down as a farmer, you go out and you plant your wheat and you sit on your front porch for 3 weeks waiting for the little shoots to come up, and you just sit there, right? Waiting for the wheat to grow. And for somebody who's ADD, that would be painful. But for somebody who's a good farmer, hey, I can just sit here and I don't need a lot of arousal and I'm not going to make any impulsive decisions. And and then when the harvest comes in, going out and picking bugs off plants day after day, hour after hour, week after week, month after month, just picking bugs off plants. Yep, this is what we do. And that then became putting a bolt on a nut or a nut on a bolt, or whatever the proper language is, in a car factory or on an assembly line. We all became farmers basically, and we built our schools literally out of this agricultural model, so much so that we take summer off so the kids can bring the crops in. And along the industrial model that Henry Ford pioneered with the assembly line, our schools have become assembly lines. So our schools are structurally hostile to the kind of brain wiring that brought the human race to where it's at. The Ben Franklins and Thomas Edisons of the world, both of whom dropped out of high school, by the way. And Thomas Edison was kicked out when he was 7 years old. And so that's why I say if you have ADD, you're a hunter in a farmer's world. So then the question of medication, what do you do about this? Paradoxically, stimulant medications produce a sense of stimulation, which causes people who need a sense of stimulation to relax. Because now, hey, I'm stimulated, so I can sit here and pay attention. So the question then is, if you're going to have a farmer-based classroom, do you medicate your kids or not, turn them into farmers? Because basically what stimulant medications do is they turn hunter kids into farmer kids. And this has to do, I believe the mechanism has to do with dopamine and thalamic gain, and there's this whole scientific explanation that I can lay on you, but it's probably far more granular than we need to get. I personally believe, and I've seen this in a lot of kids, and although we weren't using meds in the program for abused kids that we started back in the 70s, back in 78, but I've seen in my own family, and I've seen others, not my kids, but my brothers and friends and whatnot. I personally think that failure in school is more destructive to a child than taking a stimulant medication. Now, time may prove me wrong, but I'm not an absolute opponent of stimulant medications for kids. And I've tried them myself. I know how they work. You know, I know that I can focus better when I take them. I just don't like the way I feel. I would much rather, you know, but I think this is, you know, like a lot of the people who got caught up in cocaine and meth, they're probably ADD people because these are stimulants and they bring them down, you know, or they stabilize them so that they can function in boring jobs. We once had a bookkeeper who screwed up our taxes year after year. He was the cousin of a close friend of mine. And finally I sat him down and I said, you know, he was so ADD, but his father had been a bookkeeper, his grandfather had been a bookkeeper. I said, you're so ADD, you shouldn't be a bookkeeper. And he's like, well, what should I do? I said, you should be a salesman for your accounting company. Get out there, you know, selling is a hunting job. You're on the hunt. And he shifted and he became a salesman for accounting services and really grew the firm and stopped screwing up my taxes. You know, it was a wonderful thing. So, but that said, I would say that providing medication is a step, but I don't think it's the optimal step. I think the optimal step is to reinvent our schools so that they're hunter-friendly as well as farmer-friendly. And then we won't need the medications. And that's one of the crusades that I've launched with my books. I've written a couple of books about reinventing our schools. Probably the most comprehensive one is Thom Hartmann's Complete Guide to ADHD, where I go back into the history of the schools and Queen Teresa of Austria, who started the first spin and Schulen in the late 1700s, early 1800s in Austria, where parents would bring their children and half the year they would spin cloth and the other half they would be educated. And the education was how the government paid for the spinning of the cloth was how they paid for the education, and the education was what the kids got in exchange for the work that they did. And then over time that changed to a public school model as we outlawed child labor. And anyhow, I go through all that, the whole history of education.
Diana, you're on Book TV with Thom Hartmann. Diana's in Galesburg, Illinois.
Hey, Diana.
Hi. I love C-SPAN. Just wanted you to know. My question, Tom, is you do support Bernie quite readily, and I do think he's a good person, and I have always followed his, programming on your program. However, I don't think that I could vote for him, and the reason is that he is for the drone program, and he's very strongly militarily involved with the drone program, and I couldn't vote for him. So thank you for your time, and let me know how you respond to that. Thanks.
Sure. I don't know, Bernie's been a guest on my program every Friday for a lot of years, and I've never heard him speak highly of drones. I would have to, feeltheburn.org is probably the best website for Bernie's positions on the issues. I'd have to go there and look it up. But all that said, yes, I support Bernie Sanders. I also support Hillary Clinton. I think that she has the potential to be a great president. And people say, oh, but she was on the board of directors of Walmart, and they take money from corporations, and they've got a super PAC and all this kind of stuff, as if to imply that somehow she's corrupt. I think we need to remember that Franklin Roosevelt was the governor of New York State during the period which led to the Great Depression. And that all happened in New York State. That was Wall Street. His attorney general, Eric Schneiderman, is the New York attorney general now. He's going after the banksters. But Roosevelt's attorney general did not go after the banksters. Roosevelt was part of the Tammany Hall machine. He was being investigated for corruption, for corruptly appointing a judge when he was running for president. I mean, you could argue he was the corrupt governor of one of the most corrupt states in the United States. He became president of the United States during a time of great national crisis, and he flipped. He became, in my opinion, one of the best presidents we've ever had. And that's not to say that Hillary Clinton is corrupt or whatever, but the point is that he knew what Franklin Roosevelt knew from having been governor of New York and having been as corrupt as he was. He knew where the power was. He knew where the bodies were buried. He knew how to make things happen. He knew how to get things done. I think All of those are true of Hillary Clinton. I think she has tremendous leadership potential and capabilities. I would prefer Bernie Sanders as president. I endorse Bernie as president. But if it's Hillary, I will vote for her with no hesitation whatsoever, because I think she would be a great president, particularly in a time of crisis. And I think that we are, I know that we are in a time of crisis worldwide, and I believe that an economic crisis is coming as well.
Clark, Bloomfield, New Jersey. Please go ahead. I think you're going to be the last call today.
Okay. Hello, gentlemen. I was originally wanted to criticize Tom, but I have four things I want to say. Like the first two were criticisms, but I'm going to let that slide. I just want to ask you two questions. Your life. You said before your life changed on the Vietnam War. And that event changed your life from being a Republican to a Democrat. I don't understand that, because the Vietnam War was a Democrat war. It wasn't even a war. It was an illegal action.
Yeah.
It just blows my mind for people to
So
say,
you'd like him to explain that a little bit more, Clark? Thank you very much.
Yeah. First of all, the Vietnam War didn't turn me into a Democrat. I was largely apolitical in a partisan way until probably 15 years ago or so. I was more of the school of a pox on all their houses. It caused me to question my own government. It caused me to question the wisdom of politicians. It caused me to, a lot of us, I think, who grew up in that time realized that we had been lied to. The Gulf of Tonkin resolution was a lie. Lyndon Johnson, I think, was a great president, except that he had this Vietnam War thing. And yeah, it was, it wasn't just a Democratic war, Democratic Party war. I mean, Richard Nixon continued it, and in fact sabotaged in 1968. Nixon sabotaged Lyndon Johnson's attempts to negotiate a truce. He'd actually worked it out. And there's just 3 years ago, the Johnson Library just released a tape of Lyndon Johnson talking to Everett Dirksen, in which he's saying, Everett, I'm reading their hand. They're over there telling two not to negotiate with me until after the election. This is treason. And Everett Dirksen says, I know. And he's like, can you talk to Nixon and get him to stop it? Nixon wouldn't stop it. But, anyhow, it was a political awakening for me. It was not necessarily a shift from Republican to Democrat.
What are you going to talk about tomorrow on the show?
I don't know. I'm sorry. What's so wonderful about doing a talk show, and I'm guessing probably you have this sense of it too with doing these shows, is that you just never know what's going to come up, and you work with what's right in front of you. And so after we're done today, I'll be going back home and going through all the news and looking for, in particular, the stories that are not necessarily the ones that everybody's talking about, the ones that actually important things are pivoting on.
Are you working on another book right now, Mr. Hartmann?
Yeah, I'm working on a couple of them. I'm working on one about the Supreme Court, and this is an area where I agree with Phyllis Schlafly and Newt Gingrich. In fact, if I get this book written, I want to approach them about writing a foreword or a blurb. I've had Phyllis Schlafly and Newt Gingrich on my program many times, and we absolutely agree on this stuff about the court.
For the last 3 hours, Thom Hartmann has been our guest on Book TV's In Depth. Book TV now continues. Thanks for watching.
I'm the leading state sponsor of terrorism.